yeah, we got to overturn.
You're listening to the E-Men, inside the NYPD's Emergency Service Unit. Well, if the New York Yankees, New York Giants, or New York Jets disappointed you this weekend, and like you, I am one of those people who was disappointed this weekend, you can forget about that now and enjoy a nice evening of the Mike the New Haven podcast. And welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this 375, episode 375 of the Mike the New Haven podcast, as we are now firmly on the march to 400. And it's been a while. Well, I did one recently, but it's been a while since I've spoken to someone who was in the NYPD Emergency Service Unit for this mini-series, the E-Men inside the NYPD's Emergency Service Unit, which hits volume 53. When I did the show with Mike Grant a few weeks back, he was in a version of it, of course, EMRU on the transit side. But he never quite worked in the NYPD emergency service side of things, which is fine. It's still made for a great show. But with tonight's guest, who a lot of you were very excited that I was going to have on, as I was telling him off the air before we came on, we get into someone's career who was firmly embedded in the unit for 16 years, as a matter of fact, 1985 until he retired in 2001. All of that in 6 truck in Brooklyn, as we will talk about tonight. One of 3 trucks that the ESU has operating in that bureau, or borough, I should say, not bureau. If you haven't checked out the previous episode, that, of course, was a lot of fun. Bob Martinez, who was in charge of fleet services for the New York City Police Department and had a big hand in making sure that police officers got to the emergencies in the first place, just as critical to their work, of course, as any tool they may carry, is making sure they can very much get there in the first place. And Bob had a big hand in that, retired as Deputy Commissioner of Fleet Services a few years ago, 2023 to be exact. Fun conversation at an aspect of the police department that not a lot of people, at least in the public eye, necessarily think about. So fun to get a look at everything that he did. So I won't keep tonight's guest waiting too long. We'll run a couple ads, as you know by now. And of course, we will introduce him momentarily. But first things first, he's working hard on his own show, in addition to this show, and that's producer Victor and the Chop Seat podcast. Baseball fans, if you bleed Braves country red and blue, this one's for you. Check out the Chop Seat podcast hosted by Victor Mignetis. Every week, Victor dives deep into all things Atlanta Braves and Major League Baseball, from game recaps and trade rumors to player spotlights and the latest league news. Whether it's breaking down the lineup, debating pitching rotations, or talking postseason chances, the Chop Seat gives you honest takes, sharp analysis, and a fan's true passion for the game. So if you're looking for your go-to Braves and MLB podcast, pull up a chair and join the conversation. Subscribe to the Chop Seat today on Spotify, Apple Podcast, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcast. Because in Braves country, there's always room at the Chop Seat. Game 3 tomorrow between the Yankees and the Blue Jays. I think that'll personally be the Yankees' last game of the season, especially if they keep pitching the way they're pitching. But again, like I always say, while they may let you down on the PI side of things, you know who never lets you down? Billy Ryan. The Mike the New Haven podcast is proudly sponsored and supported by the Ryan Investigative Group. If you need an elite PI, look no further than the elite Ryan Investigative Group, which is run by retired NYPD detective Bill Ryan, a 20-year veteran of the department who served the majority of his career in the Detective Bureau, most notably in the Arson and Explosion Squad. So if you need a PI to handle anything from fraud, legal services, and anything else that you might require, contact Bill at 347-417-1610. Again, 347-417-1610. Reach him at his website or the email that you see here. Again, if you need a PI, look no further than Bill Ryan and the Ryan Investigative Group, a proud supporter and sponsor of the Mike the New Haven podcast. Bill, of course, also the executive producer and co-creator of our other mini-series of this program, one of the first that I launched, Tales from the Boom Room, profiles from the NYPD's Arson, Explosion, and Bomb Squad. But from that, like I mentioned, also stems this, which is volume 53 tonight, the E-Men inside the NYPD's Emergency Service Unit, with my next guest, who's a Brooklyn cop who worked his way from patrol in one of the city's busier precincts, of course, the elite ranks of the NYPD Emergency Service Unit. Along the way, he not only became a first responder, but also a teacher, passing down those life-saving skills needed for any e-cop to the next generation at the STS school. And with a background that is as unique as his story is, from safe cracking in the private sector to teaching ropes, locks, and tools inside the Emergency Service Unit, his journey reflects the grit, adaptability, and heart that defines a unit that is like no other, not just in New York City, but anywhere in the country, anywhere in the world. And that for this volume 53 of the E-Men inside the NYPD's Emergency Service Unit, retired out of 6 truck, did 16 years in ESU, Carl Russo. Carl, welcome. How are you?
I'm good. How are you tonight?
Good. Thanks for doing this. I appreciate you coming on. This is something we've talked about for a while, so nice to see it come to fruition, as you guys know in the chat by now. And I know a lot of you who worked with Carl should be in the chat tonight. If you got a question, fire away in the chat. We'll highlight it at the appropriate time. Hello to Pete Pranzo, retired NYPD Lieutenant John Costello, Joe Maliga. Appreciate you guys always being here. So born and raised in Brooklyn, but raised in part by Mrs. Sims. Tell us who she was and what part of the borough that you grew up in.
I grew up in Brooklyn in Bedford-Stuyvesant on Franklin Avenue, and Mrs. Sims lived on the corner. And she was an elderly black woman, elderly in my opinion. I mean, I was 8 or 9 years old, so she could have been 50 years old for all I know, but she was a gray-haired lady, and my mother would work during the day. My father would work during the day, and Mrs. Sims would pick me up from school, take me back to her house, and her grandson and I were the best friends, and Mrs. Sims was always there for me.
And she instilled a lot of character, and as I'm sure your parents did early on in you, that would shape your path. Now, guys of a certain age often point to Emergency, the television show back then, which was popular as their inspiration to go into the civil service field, and maybe they had family on the job. Did you know what you wanted to do from an early age, or did that come to you later?
Well, I'll tell you what happened. My mother and I were walking. I think we were on Washington Avenue, and some guy had fallen down on the floor, and he maybe had a heart attack or whatever. And a huge crowd gathered around him. And I'm a little guy at this point in time, and I'm trying to peek into the crowd, and I really can't see what's going on. And then all of a sudden, I guess a police car pulls up at the curb. I'm not aware where these two guys came from, but these two huge Irish police officers show up, and the crowd parts like it's the Red Sea, and these guys walk right in. And I said to myself, these guys are something, and I think it was at that point in time where I said, you know what, I think I want to be a police officer. And when all the kids wanted to be a cowboy and a fireman and a police officer, I always wanted to be a police officer.
And that was a path that would ultimately lead you to 1981, which I'll get to in a moment. But attending school in the city, as you did, you went to East New York High School, but you also partook in the FAA aviation program. Mm-hmm. So even though you wanted to be a police officer, was there any inclination to wanting to go into the aircraft industry at some point too?
No, it's just that I don't consider myself a real smart guy, to be honest with you, but my hands are good, you know what I mean? And I know that working with my hands, being an aircraft mechanic or being a mechanic in general was, if all else failed, I would have a way through life and be where I want to be,
Mm-hmm. And you got to the police academy later. I was telling you off the air, the guy that shared that in common with you, our late friend, Rich Teamsma, because Rich, when he did the academy in 82, was 32 years old. He'd worked in the aircraft industry for a while. He'd been a Marine, and before he took on the job as a New York City police officer. So let's go through the timeline here, and you can highlight each of it as you go. Plumber's helper for a year after high school. Then you worked for the safe company, which is when their safe cracking skills came into effect. So tell us about just learning those skills and how that shaped you for what would come later while you waited to get on the job.
Well, I'll tell you a funny story about being the plumber's helper. And I remember exactly where I was. There was a bar on 4th Avenue in Brooklyn. I guess it was 66, 67th Street, which ultimately I wind up at the 6-8 precinct in Truck 6, which is 3 blocks away. But anyway, there was a bar there, and I was sent in to clean a urinal. The urinal was broken. It was drained. It was clogged. So as I unscrewed the drain plug, urine runs down my arm. And I said to myself, there's got to be a better way. There's got to be a better way than this. That's when I decided to make my move from plumber's helper to look around and see if I could get something else that might work for me.
And that's where safe cracking.
That's when I applied. I went to Mosler Safe, and I said, I'm willing to learn if and I took a couple of tests with them and this, that, and the other thing. And before you know it, a friend of mine put a good word in for me. I had a rabbi there, and I was working for Mosler. They sent me to Hamilton, Ohio for safe cracking. They sent me there for alarms, for remote transaction systems, drive-up windows. So I went to all the schools that they had. Anytime there's a school available, I try to take it so that I can just increase the knowledge that I have.
That's a good approach to have. I will ask you, because this is unfamiliar to me, so this is where you can help me along, Carl. Was it akin to kind of being a Brinks armored car guard in the sense that are you carrying a gun for this type of job, or not really?
For Mosler?
Yeah.
Oh, no. I was just a mechanic, I had a suitcase filled with tools that had casters on the bottom, and I worked in Manhattan. I would probably do 8-10 miles a day walking from place to place. There was all the banks and facilities in Manhattan that have, safes and all sorts of security devices. I would take care of all that stuff. No, I was bonded for over $1 million. Mosley had me bonded, because I worked in the gold depository. I was all over the place,
Yeah,
Any
of
place
course.
there was I'm sorry.
No, I said, yeah, of course.
Yeah, any place there was a lock or a safe, a time lock, that's where I was.
And
So.
a good place to be. Good cardio too, walking 8 to 10 miles. Yeesh.
Oh, I'm telling you, it was easy that day. I would if I had the time, like if there was a job on 59th Street and then there was a job on 14th Street, I would just walk down to 14th Street. Not a big deal.
Yeah, listen, if you can, you can. Especially if, I mean, even whether good or bad, listen, work your legs, keeps you around longer. Listen, I did the walk myself. I was down in the city for 9/11. I thought to myself, the day's nice, so I walked all the way from the World Trade Center to Grand Central, hour and a half, but it was worth it. Good leg day right there. Talking with Carl Russo is volume 53 of the E-Men inside the NYPD's emergency service unit. Hello to John Latanzio in the chat. I see you popping up, my friend. Alumni, of course. A 5-truck first and 3-truck was also a housing rescue guy back when they had, for a brief time, their own emergency service unit, a version of emergency service. Emergency rescue was called. So finally that call comes, right? Or at least that letter comes that you're going to the police academy.
Mm-hmm.
So take me through your emotions when finally, this call or this letter that you've been waiting for your whole life, it seems, because you mentioned wanting to be a police officer since a little bit.
So I take the test in 81 there, and I guess it's in 80 because 81 I get I get a phone call Friday night, and it's my investigator. And he says, if you want to go to transit, I can put you in right now, he says. Mm-hmm. And I thought about it for a second. I said, no, I don't think I want to go to transit. I says, I want to be a real police officer. I want to be a city cop. No offense to any transit cops out there, because you guys worked hard. It's not what I wanted to do. I wanted to be out on the street and see the people and stuff like that. I enjoy being with people. So he says, okay, and he hangs up on me. Saturday morning, I get another call. He says, you're in the next class. I said, what class? He says, a regular police officer. So I think they were trying to suck me into transit, but when I turned that down, they put me into the regular class. So 81, yeah, I'm excited, and as a lot of guys, you start out, they put you in the auditorium and they give you 1 million papers to sign in front of you. You're picking out your person who's, if you're going to die, who's going to get their money, and you're picking out things that are going to mean down the road, all this information that what you're going to do, your retirement, when you're looking 20 years, and it all happens so fast, and the next day you're out getting your T-shirts with your name on the back and your shorts and everything else, and you're running in the gym.
And that was a 6-month academy.
6-month academy, yeah. So
you had a lot of life experience, but even then, it's not easy. The academy is very much a mind game. Doesn't matter, and I said this a million times in the program before. Rather if it's a police academy or fire academy, it's not necessarily how strong you are physically, although that certainly does help and goes a long way if you are, but how strong you are mentally. Because especially back then, instructors, they pulled no punches. They didn't throw anything at you that, they weren't trying to see, okay, who's going to crack, who can handle it, who can't. So just tell me about those 6 months, getting through it, and finally getting to graduation.
You talk about the police academy and everything. Vick and myself, we were in the same academy class. Not the same company, but the academy class. He was there in 81. Right. And I marveled at Vick, because as I was stressing and straining and trying to get through the police academy, he was studying to be a doctor at the same time. And to him it came easy. So Vick is a smart guy, and he's somebody that to look up at. It's just, but in the academy, I have one recollection of the academy. I took it seriously, maybe more seriously than I should have. And I boxed when I boxed, because we still were boxing then. I don't know if they box anymore.
I don't think so.
So when I boxed hard, And one day, they put me up against this other kid. His name was Ponsiglione. That was his last name. Him and I were the two hardest. And he hit me so hard in the face that he knocked my mouthpiece out. And everybody in the gym went, ooh. So I went over, I picked up my mouthpiece, I washed it off in the sink, I put it back in, and I went out back on the floor and I fought. And, and after that, I think the instructors looked at me differently.
Oh, yeah, that's something that they have, of course, some variation of PT now, but the boxing thing, that's I know for a fact that's definitely gone away in recent. And it's tough because I get it. You don't want to hurt recruits per se. You don't want to get them too banged up in the academy because then they can't go out in the street. But in the job, it hasn't changed much, especially now. You're going to fight. There's going to come a point in time where de-escalation is not going to work because you're going to have somebody so belligerent, you're going to have to fight.
No, I'm going to tell you something that I believe. I've seen a lot of people shot and wounds that you would think would be life-threatening or that would have killed them, they survived through. And yet sometime there'll be a person who gets shot and just the shock of it kills them. You know what I mean? I've seen people get shot in the head where the bullet traveled into the front, went across the head, all right, that didn't go through their skull, went like between the skin and then came out the other side. And you say to yourself, how's that possible? But it happens. Yeah. Some people are built like that. I think that before you walk into the police academy, they should smack you in the face and then see how, if you cry, if you don't cry, if you walk away happy, and see how you handle just that slap in the face, just that one when you get punched and you don't know that that you're going to get it. You know what I mean?
Right. Well, Mike Tyson's what is his line? Listen, everybody's got a plan until they get hit in the face.
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about.
That's what Tyson used to say all the time. Dave Norman, I mentioned him to you off the air. Of course, I said he'd be watching. Sure enough, he is. I see him in the chat. Hi, Dave. Give me a call, Dave. Come on the show, Dave. Hopefully I can get Dave on because I know he's got great stories from his years in one truck. So if I annoy him enough, Carl, if I just keep being annoying to Dave, eventually he'll be sitting across from me.
Squeaky wheel gets the grease.
Exactly. Good to see you, my friend. And good to see you too, Eric Fries, tuned in via LinkedIn, retired NYPD detective, former guest of this show a while ago as well. And he told some great stories when he came on. NSU 16 in Queens. You covered a variety of precincts. So you were in there for, I think, was it 6 months to a year back then?
Yeah, 6 months. Yeah, we got out and then in January, January is 6 months NSU.
Yeah.
And NSU, I had a lot of good memories in NSU. I'll tell you one quick story. I'm walking up Ditmars Boulevard, and I walk in front of a cafe there. At that point in time, it was still a lot of Greeks. I guess it's still Greek up there. I haven't been there lately, so I don't know. But I walk in front of this Greek cafe, and there's a car sitting on a hydrant. Now, I'm brand new, and I'm going to do my job. I'm going to take my summons book out, and I'm going to write a summons. So I pull the summons book out of my pocket, and I start to write the summons. And the owner of the restaurant comes running out. He says, stop. He says, it's the lieutenant's car. I said, oh, okay. Well, with that, I'm standing there. And who walks out of the restaurant but Telly Savalas, Lieutenant Kojak? So yes. I said, and he says to me, he says, oh, I'm sorry, officer. I says, I'm sorry. And I'm standing there in awe. I said, no, there's no problem, and he drives away. But, the lieutenant's car, I'm thinking that somebody from the 114 or whatever, what it is. But no, it was Telly Savalas. So that was
he did a great job. He did a great job portraying that character. Still iconic portrayal to this day.
Oh, there's no doubt about it. There's no doubt about it.
Great show. The reruns are available. So you got scooter qualified around this time. That's a skill that would help you later on. How'd that happen?
Well, here's what happens. So a couple of things happen. I walk in on a bank robbery, and it's my very first collar. A bank robbery. So now I'm getting a pat on the back from my NSU sergeant. A couple of days later, we're on a strike post. I don't know if it was Ronzoni or if it was Arrow Staples. I forget which one it was, but we're on a strike post. And what I used to do is all the cars that had any kind of interaction with the strike post people, the people who were on the strike, I would take their plate number down. Guys who were delivering food to them, guys that would just come over and give them water, guys that were sympathetic to the strike people. I took their plate number and I put it in my book and I didn't think anything about it. So one night I go to meal, I come back and there was a fire. What happened is that some guy drove by in his car and threw a Molotov cocktail out. Started a fire on the side of the building. The only thing is that he had taken his plate off the car, drove by. There was no plate. Nobody had nothing. They had a description of the car, but they had no real information on it. So they tell me, says, it was a white Mustang with a black fender. I said, well, I got that guy's plate number. They said, what do you mean you got that guy's plate number? So I says, he was parked here the other day. I says, it was one of the cars that I took his plate number. So with that, they made a collar for arson. So with my bank robbery and my arson, my NSU Sergeant Foster, John Foster, he says to me, he says, you're doing a good job. I want to do something for you. Yeah, okay. So, like I said, I'll take any school you want to give me. He says, I can send you either to scooter school, he says, or I can send you to auto crime school. I says, I'd like to go to scooter school. He says, okay. I mean, that's unheard of, and NSU, because they don't really do that. So he sends me to scooter school and I get my scooter license, which later down the road becomes very important to me during my career.
And why was that?
Well, what happens is this, is that I go to the 8-3 precinct. All right, let's finish up NSU for a while. We go to the 8-3 precinct, and I'm the only person scooter qualified there. So what happens is that the CO calls me in one day, Inspector Perini. He says to me, he says, you're the only one scooter qualified. He says, I need you to, there's going to be a parade. He says, I want you in the front of the parade. He says, I want your partner in the back with the RMP. He says, but, he says, you're going to have to do a tour change. He says, I can't give you overtime. I can't. I said, no problem. He says, I'll do whatever you need to do. With that, I was, like I said, the only scooter cop in the A3. And at that point in time, I would go up and down Knickerbocker Avenue, moving the double parkers. I did this. And Perini liked me because, I did what he needed me to do at that point in time. Then we'll leave the A3 for a few minutes. I go to the summer detail. I go to summer detail, and we're all mustering up. And the summer detail sergeant says, is anybody scooter qualified? So I'm looking around the room. Nobody raises their hand. Again, I'm the only person scooter qualified. He says, okay, you're going to be the 6-0 amusement scooter for the summer. That was the entire summer that we were there. I was on scooter. While everybody else was standing on a foot post, I was out doing whatever I wanted to do. But at the same time, I was making arrests. I was writing summonses. I was doing my job because I liked it there. Now, like I said, they have a saying in the 6-0 that once the sand gets in your shoes, you don't want to leave the place. And the sand got in my shoes. We used to have parties on the beach. It was just a great time. I knew all the people in the amusement area. There was a guy, a retired cop, who ran the bumper cars. He treated me like gold. I would bring my son there, and he would give my son rolls of quarters and just let him play the machines because it didn't cost him anything. He was getting the quarters back in his pocket. You know what I mean? It's not a big deal. And it was just a great time in Coney Island at that point in time.
So safe to say the only unit you would have left Coney Island for was emergency.
Oh, there's no doubt about it. Because once I was in Coney Island, like I said, I was making as many collars as a summons man and out on the scooter as they were in anti-crime. I was, that's what they said, we need his numbers. So they took me and they put me in anti-crime. Here's a picture of this. This is a fellow by the name of Bonsley Nimmons. Can you see that?
Yeah, just elevate it a little bit. Just raise it a little bit. There we go.
Okay, so that's Bonsley Nimmons, and him and his girlfriend, they were stealing purses. So one day I drive up to his girlfriend. Her name was Cynthia Levy. I said, Cynthia, I said, what do you do with all those purses that you steal? So she says, oh, you want them? She says, I got them for you. So she goes in and gets them for me. So with that, Bonsley comes out, and him and I are on Brighton Beach Avenue, and we're in wrestling, and we're in the wrestling mode. We're fighting back and forth, and I have to collar him. But the strange thing, or the interesting thing about this too, Bonsley and Cynthia, Bonsley would get her pregnant, and then they'd sell the baby.
Oh God.
Yeah. So
Jeez.
yeah. So they were pillars of the community.
Evidently, right? Listen, here's a baby for you, everybody gets one.
Yeah.
It's okay. All righty. Oh, well, that's...
Well, you know what? There's desperate people out there who can't have
Right.
a child. And but to do something, to roll the dice like that, because you just don't know what you're going to get. Cynthia was a drug addict. Bonsley was whatever he was. And it's just the way it was.
Yeah, that's a classic only in New York City type of story. Not to say it can't happen anywhere else, but something like that, usually the chances are, for whatever reason, it's a higher volume of that happening in the city of 8 million people. Like I've always said in the program, 8 million people, 8 million stories. Volume 53 of the E-Men inside the NYPD's Emergency Service Unit. Our guest tonight's Carl Russo. So anti-crime and RIP, I mean, again, like I've talked about with guys who work plainclothes before, different ball game, different dynamic, especially with anti-crime, because unless it's a 1013, you're not chasing jobs on the radio. You're listening to the radio, but it's more so observing. So what you enjoy about anti-crime and just kind of taking on a different style of policing, especially back then.
Well, I'll tell you what happened. We had a bad robbery situation on the west end of Coney Island, and they dressed me up as an old man because all the old men were getting mugged and everything. They dressed me up as an old man.
Right.
So my wife, who worked in a 6-0 at that point in time, she walked in, and I was standing right next to her, and she didn't know it was me. So I'm hitting her on the leg with my cane, like, "Hey, sweetie," and she's looking at me, like brushing me off, not realizing it's me. And then finally I said, "Dolores, it's me." And then it was hard to believe because I look so good. But we were able to get that group because of like you say, good police work, good investigatory work. Looking for what we had to look, and we busted these guys. They were really bad. They used to knock over old ladies, and then just grab their purse. They really didn't care about anybody. That's just what it was.
Yeah, if you get to target such a vulnerable group, it goes to show, right?
Yeah, that was
pillars of the community, right, Carl?
That's it. That's it.
Yeah, well, good job in bringing those guys down. I feel like anti-crime and RIP tie together because it's a lot of the same guys you're after, a lot of the same collars you're making. Usually anti-crime, you're getting guns off the street, robberies, you're stopping them before they happen. RIP, it's more the same thing. I mean, identifying a pattern, yes, and then going after the same guys that you would if you were an anti-crime.
Right. Well, that's exactly right. That's why the RIP unit was made up of all the anti-crime guys. The better guy, or I'm not going to say better, but the guys who are probably more productive. They took them and put them in the RIP. And with the RIP unit, we used to have photo albums because each time we locked somebody up, we took a Polaroid and we put it in the album. So when a person would get robbed, we'd bring them in and let them flip through our photo albums of all the local bums. You know what I mean? And pick those guys out. And it worked very well. I mean, I think it was the 7-3 RIP that had Mike Tyson's picture in it because that's why Mike originally went upstate because he was knocking over old ladies and stuff like that. So, he Customato found him upstate in the thing there with the boys.
And saved his life for the time being. Of course, Mike got into trouble later, but he's often said, the thing that kind of changed him is when Customato died.
Yeah. Well, you know what? Once he left Cuss and he went with that other guy, you know what I mean? It was the whole world of sin, and then he married the girl and the whole thing went sour on him.
Yeah, well, good thing he's doing a lot better these days.
He's excellent. And his daughter had died. You know about that story?
Very sad story.
That really flipped him. That really flipped the switch on him.
Yeah, as it would anybody who goes through such an awful experience. So that brings us, and we could spend just the entire show talking about your pre-ESU career because you did a lot in those 4 years. But that brings us into 85 when finally you get the call to emergency. Now, it helped that you had all these skills prior, scooter qualified, of course, working with safes. So it takes about at least, unless you have a good hook, 5 years of patrol, close to it. You had 4 to get into emergency. Did you have a hook or was it just a straightforward application to get into ESU?
I had my wife's father kind of, I think, was my hook. He was a captain on the job, and I think he knew people, and I think that's how I kind of weaseled my way in there. I know for sure if it was nowadays, because the guys down at STS now, they really bust their ass. I mean, I think that a lot of guys I know, probably including myself, probably wouldn't be able to make it through this STS. I'm not a swimmer, to be honest with you. So right off the bat, they'd have to kick me out. So.
Yeah. And back then now it's 9 months.
Yeah.
The guys that are going through it now. I remember Ray Ruiz telling me this. I don't know if I'm sure it's true in your case too, but correct me if I'm wrong. Was it 6 weeks for you back then?
Oh, yeah. I'm pretty sure it was 6 weeks. Yeah. And, we crammed every day. There was something going on. These guys did everything. They ropes and tools and there was no fooling around. It was a legitimate school as best we could make,
Right. And it's so much to learn in a short period of time, but you learned. And of course, you learned even more once you got to your respective trucks upon graduation. Billy Kennedy says in the chat, Carl Russo, great cop, even better E-man, love you, brother. So he sends his regards. Wow. And as I mentioned, Kenny Bowen is in the chat as well. He says, both great guys, both were cops and sergeants in ESU respectively. So get in the 6 truck, which is in the 6-8 precinct, if I remember correctly.
That's correct.
So tell me about the guys that you learned from early on, the E-men that shaped you.
Well, I'll tell you a funny story. I'm there maybe 1 or 2 days, and Billy DeSantis, who ultimately becomes probably my long-term partner, he wants to take me down. He says, come on. He says, I'll take you downstairs and show you how to start the tools and stuff like that. And I was pretty well versed in all that stuff like that, but I didn't say to him, look, I know what I'm doing. I know, there's no reason to go downstairs. I let him go downstairs. We went downstairs, show me what you know. This way, maybe there's something that I don't know. I'm not so smart that you're going to tell me that I know everything. You know what I mean? I'm going to work with you. And he went down. He showed me a few things and things that I didn't know, or things that and he showed me, and he took me under his wing. But there was a lot of guys, Eddie Crean, a lot of guys that were there, and people who have passed. Jack Murphy, Eddie Crean, Louis Marsicano, guys like that were in emergency for years. Some of these guys were in that. Did you know about that robbery unit where the guys used to come out and just? You ever hear about that?
No, go ahead, tell me.
Well, they were back in the 70s, I guess it was, and it was a very successful unit. It was a robbery unit. Let's say there was I can tell you for a fact because I was working in the bagel place. I used to make bagels in the 70s, and we used to get robbed all the time. I mean, they would come in and just rob us. So what happened is that they put us down as a chronic location, and there was a robbery squad. These guys would stay in the back of the location with a shotgun, and if the robber would come in, they would kill him. And what happened was that they would let the robbery go down. They'd come out the back door, and as the guy was coming through the door, they'd kill him. And a lot of guys, it was so successful that they had to take it down and do away with it.
Can you imagine that today?
Yeah, no.
God.
The robbery squad. I'm sure there's still guys out there that'll talk about it. Some of the older guys.
Yeah, that would never fly today in today's.
No, I'm telling you. And they with the bare minimum, they'd come out with a cap on, and police don't move. And I don't even know if they yell "police don't move." I know that their primary weapon was a shotgun, and most of those guys were from ESU.
Yeah, I mean, listen, if you don't want it to happen, you shouldn't be stealing.
Well, yeah.
Law of averages. Law of averages. And what do they say? Murphy's Law. Murphy's an Irishman. So, you catch up with them. So, I mean, at least in the early years, tell me, because I mean, I remember somebody telling me this years ago. I think it was Glenn Klein when he was on the show, where he mentioned it takes about a good 5 years to really finally feel like an E-man and finally feel comfortable in the unit. So, from those early years in ESU, tell me about the jobs, either tactical or rescue-wise, that stick out, where afterwards you're like, man, that was something.
Well, let's do a couple of animal jobs.
Sure.
Okay, let's do a couple of animal jobs. So we're in the precinct, and we get the job to respond that there's a baby in the sewer. All right. So we go to the location. I'm trying to remember what precinct. 6-6. It was in a 6-6 precinct. We go to the location, and you listen at the sewer, and it sounds like a baby crying, but you can't really figure out where it's coming from because it's in the sewer. All right. And it hadn't rained in a couple of days. So it could have been a block away, one way or the other, wherever it was. So we start to narrow it down. We go to one sewer, to another sewer, to another sewer, to another sewer. Finally, we narrow it down, and we go and we find out that someone had thrown a pregnant cat down the base and down into the sewer, and the cat had kittens.
Oh my God.
And that's what people were thinking was the baby's crying, that it was the cat crying. So that was one of our jobs. It was me, it was Patty Murphy, Jimmy Cole. These guys have passed from the 9/11 stuff like that. But that was a big one. Actually, we made the newspaper on that one.
There you go. Yeah, I can see the picture there. There you go. Because earlier the light was kind of interfering with it, but I see it clearly now.
I'm going to shut the light off over my head. Give me 1 second. I'm just going to get up.
That's fine. Talking with Carl Russo here in the Mike the New Haven podcast, volume 53 of the E-Men inside the NYPD's emergency service unit. And it's funny, you mentioned Patty Murphy. You didn't have to do that. I appreciate it, though. You mentioned Patty Murphy, and it's the episode of Cops that he's in. That's one of the jobs he responds to. Two of them, actually. One was, of course, the rat in the bathroom, and the other one was a bat in somebody's apartment. So, he was in 2 truck for a while. He was also in 5 truck for a while as well. And he ended up having a great career in emergency, and he died back in 2014, sadly, from, as you said, 9/11 cancer. He was way too young.
Yes, way too young. There's no doubt about it.
So besides the pregnant cat, rather. Yeah, there you go. Pregnant cat, rather. What were the other animal jobs?
So here's one of my favorites. So we're sitting in quarters. It's meal. We're all in. I think Kenny Richardson is cooking for us. We're going to have a nice lunch. And all of a sudden, the doorbell rings. I go downstairs, and the guy says to me, he says, you got to come to my apartment. You got to come to my apartment. I said, well, what's going on? I said, well, he says, they sent me next door. From next door, they sent me here. You got to come to my apartment. I said, what's going on? He said, my friend Snake has gone crazy. I said, your friend Snake has gone crazy. I said, well, what kind of nonsense is that? So We get into the truck. We get in. We drive over. It's not far. It's on 4th Avenue, maybe 70th Street or something like that. We go into the building. I open the door, and it looks like there's been a homicide. There's blood on the walls. There's blood on the ceiling. There's blood on the furniture. And there's a guy in the corner. He's tucked in the corner with a steak knife, and there's a Burmese python up on its back like this, and it's trying to get him. And he's hacking at the snake. And each time he hacks at the snake, a little bit more blood spurts around. Ooh. And he hacks at the snake and a little bit. But this snake wants this guy. All right? We don't know why, but this snake wants this guy. So now Kenny Richardson and his partner's with me. Kenny's partner. He's going to be angry with me. But anyway, so we got the dog noose. And they grab one hand. Kenny grabs the head, and Chris grabs the tail. And the snake is 15 feet long. The snake is as long as a car. They both got the end, and all of a sudden, the snake like contracts its body and pulls them both together. With him contracting his body, now he starts to wrap himself around Chris's leg. I said, this has got to stop. So I said to the guy, I said, look, I said, we got to do something about this. So the guy says, do what you got to do. So I take an axe and I take the snake's head off.
As you do.
So I said to the guy, I says, how did this happen? I says, how did this happen? He says, I went to the pet store. He says, and I buy a rabbit to feed to the animal. He says, I put my arm in the cage with the animal, with the snake. He says, and I hold the rabbit in the other hand. The snake now travels up my arm, around my neck, and it eats the animal. It eats the rabbit. So I says, you do that all the time? He says, yeah. He says, but I think what happened this time, he says, when I went to the pet store, I leaned on the cage, and I must have had a smell on me. He said, because when the snake came up my arm, it stopped right at my face. It looked at me. He said, then it bit me in the face. He said, it went into my face and got me. He says, after that, it was on. He said, the snake was practically chasing me around the apartment.
Jeez.
So I'm telling you that once we killed the snake, we then had to go and we got 2 garbage pails. It took 2 garbage pails to put this snake in.
That's how big it was?
That's how, I'm telling you, it was as big as a car. And once he coiled it up, it was as long as a car. It had to be 15 feet long, this snake. And this is a snake that the guy had in his house. He didn't want, he was in a co-op. He didn't want them to be aware of it, but they knew he had it and they were trying to get him out all along, which ultimately, he got out.
Yeah.
His face was torn up. I'm telling you, it looked like a homicide. It looked like something out of a horror movie.
Yeah,
blood all over.
When you walk into a scene like that, and that's not even. Go ahead.
No, I'm just saying. The guy says, when you think about a snake, you think about a snake. You don't think about a snake that's as big as a car.
Right. You're thinking about like a garden snake.
Yeah, a little snake. I don't know what it is. Maybe that's it.
Well, you found out that night.
Yeah.
And that's just the start of it, too. A lot of tactical jobs back then, listen, it's, as I said before, and the old saying is when a cop needs, when somebody needs help, when a civilian needs help, they call the police. When the police need help, they call the emergency service unit. If a detective squad or even a patrol cop saying, hey, we got a guy in there, he's violent, we got him on a warrant, he's wanted on 2 homicides, you got to go in there and get him, or anything like that, man with a gun, barricaded hostage situation. I feel like, especially back then in the wild west days of the city, a lot of that was happening pretty frequently. Would you get a lot of tactical jobs like that in Six Truck?
Yeah, there was a lot of tactical jobs at Six Truck. Yeah, there was a lot of work. We had where's my thing here? The sad family fight. Here. This one happens up on I think it's on New Utrecht. And what happens is that the guy has a family fight, winds up killing 2 of his family members, and then kills himself. I think he wasted his time. He should have just killed himself to begin with, and not did anything to his family members. Sure, there was tactical jobs, but let me give you another animal job.
Sure, whatever you want to give.
Okay, so the call comes over that there's a cat down a sewer, down a drain pipe. What happens is that this lady had just got a kitten, and she put it on her roof to let it walk around. Her roof, she had a window that was the same height as the roof. What happens is the cat walks over to the rain gutter It walks down the rain gutter and it goes down the drain pipe into the sewer system of the house. So now they call us. There's only one way to get this cat out, really, is to break the concrete, dig down to the sewer, break open the sewer, and take the cat out. So I go down the basement. It's me and Billy DeSantis, and I'm looking around. I says, you know what we're going to do? I said, we're going to blow this cat out. He said, what are you talking about? Now, the Scott bottle is pressurized at 4,500 pounds, 4,500 pounds.
Oh, yeah.
I look around, and I find myself a piece of garden hose, and we cut it up, and we fit it to a Scott bottle. We tape it up nice. I take off the house side of the trap in the building, and we stick the hose down there. And I tell Billy, and then I go outside and pull the drain pipe out of the 4-inch cast iron so that the cat has had a clear path out. And I tell the precinct cop, I says, go on direct with me. I says, and tell me if the cat comes out. So what Billy does is Billy opens the bottle. He cracks it. I said, Billy, open the bottle. He cracks it real quick. It's shh, like that. I said, no, Billy. I says, open that bottle up. He says, open it up. I say, open that bottle up. So he opens the bottle all the way up. 4,500 pounds of pressure now go into the sewer system of that building. It blows the cat out up through the sewer. The cop on the other side, the precinct cop, now says to me, you hear him on the radio, he says, it came out. He says, it was like a rocket ship. He says, it came flying out of the sewer, he says. So we were able to save the cat. And without my only thing, and I think back a lot. I'm sure that the people in that building, every toilet bowl must have went bloop like that and blew the water out. And they must have walked into the toilet and said, where did all this water come from? But we blew the cat out of the sewer.
I'm just picturing that visual, all of a sudden cops on the roof, just cats.
Yeah.
Here you go. We got him out of there. And that's the thing that, highlighting these jobs, it speaks to the creativity and ingenuity of ESU. You're thinking outside the box all the time. You're picking up
There's no doubt about it.
Carl, who would think of that? That's so clever. That's on the fly.
That's how we did it. We got the cat out, and that was what was important. An animal job. I brought it broken down into I got animal jobs, I got assisting members of the service, I got stuff like that.
Yeah, whatever you want to tell. Go ahead.
Yeah. So we there was a McDonald's on Flatbush Avenue and I think Nostrand, not the junction, Flatbush and Nostrand, and they had a squirrel in the ball pit when McDonald's used to have ball pits. So somehow the squirrel ran in, got into the ball pit. So we go in there. And I'm coughing and I'm sneezing and I'm coughing and I'm sneezing. And I says to Billy, Billy, what's going on here? He says, well, didn't you hear them? He said, they maced the squirrel. I said, what do you mean they maced the squirrel? He said, yeah. He says, they thought that the squirrel would I don't know what they thought, but the cops maced the squirrel while he was in the ball pit. So I said, the bottom line is we can't do anything. Let's get out of here. And they had to clean all the balls. They had to have whoever cleans the McDonald's balls had to come in and clean the McDonald's balls.
First squirrel.
First squirrel.
I miss those ball pits. The Burger King used to have them too. I used to play in them all the time when I was smaller. So
yeah,
dang, you unlocked a childhood memory there. The nostalgia's coming back on that one.
Sure.
I do miss those ball pits.
I'm with Bobby Kevin, and it's Christmas time. It's the winter with Bobby Kevin, and we go to a job. A squirrel in the Christmas tree. The lady lives in one of the projects, and the window is close enough to a tree where the squirrel can jump from the tree into the apartment. So he jumps from the tree into the apartment, goes into her Christmas tree. So now we got a squirrel in the Christmas tree. So now Bobby Kevin, who's an old timer, good guy, he says, well, dart it. And he says, it'll come out of the tree. I said, okay, no problem. So I'm new at this point in time. I'm relatively new. I'm just going by Bobby's lead. I said, okay, no problem. Now, I don't know if you've ever seen the size of the dart that we use to dart animals. It's probably as big as a .45 caliber round, So Bobby shoots the squirrel, and instead of it being tranquilized, the dart goes right through the animal and kills it dead. So now the lady's got her Christmas packages underneath of the tree, and there's blood dripping from the squirrel onto the packages. And she says, well, what happened? I says, I think we hit him in the nose. I may have a nosebleed or something like that. So the bottom line was we had to clean her packages off, get the dead squirrel out of there, and move on to our next job. But that's just the way it is. Like you say, you don't know what's going to happen at any point in time.
No, never. You never know what type of call is going to come in. So you got the animal jobs. I know you kind of divided it into sections. Tell me about some of the rescues.
Okay, a rescue. How about we're on the top of a bridge? It's Christmas Eve. All right, the call comes over. It's Christmas Eve, and it's cold and it's snowy, and we're on the Brooklyn Bridge, and the guy is up there, and I'm trying to talk him down, and he's not really cooperating. And I said to him, then I got an idea. I said, let me ask you a question. I said, do you have any children? He said, I got a boy and a girl. I says, why are you up here to be in it? He says, well, my wife was cheating on me. I said, okay. I said, that happens a lot. I said, but are you going to kill yourself because your wife is cheating on you? I says, do you want your children to remember every Christmas Eve or every Christmas day that this is the day their father killed himself? The guy starts crying. He starts crying, and he falls towards me, just like to grab me, and he falls towards me. That guy called me up every Christmas Eve for the next 5 years, or until I left the job. Every Christmas Eve, he got me a call. And he would say to me, he says, is this you? I says, well, is it you? That's how we would identify each other. I didn't even know his name at that point in time. He says, is this you? I says, yes. I says, is this you? He says, yes. He says, I'm doing well. I says, that's the way it's. I said, that's what's important. I said, that awesome. You're doing well. Awesome. I also had a guy on the top of the Brooklyn Bridge one time. I says, look, cold and rainy, another cold. It seems like these guys pick the cold and rainy nights. I don't know if it's because they get depressed or whatever it is. I don't know what it is.
Like seasonal depression.
Yeah. I said to him, I says, it's really cold up here. I says, it's rainy. I says, you know what? I says, listen to me. You want to jump. I says, you either jump now. I says, or come back tomorrow when the weather's nice, and then you could jump then. I says, you can jump whenever you want. I said, this is not something that has to be decided right now. I said, we can decide this on our own. So he looks at me. I says, it's cold out here. I said, come on, we'll leave. And the guy left. I says, come on, we'll leave. I says, this is not the night to kill yourself in the cold and the rain. I says, you can pick any other night. I said, why tonight?
Whatever works, though. Whatever works.
That's
the key is just to get them down. You get them down.
That's it. That's whatever works is right. You got to play to them. You got to talk to them. You can keep them talking. As long as those people are talking, you've got a chance. It's when they stop talking, that's when the problems begin. Now they're drawing themselves up into a cocoon. They're shutting themselves down. They don't want to know nothing from nothing. But at the same time, it's very important to keep the conversation going, keep the dialogue going, because as long as you have the dialogue going with them, you have a connection. The minute you lose that connection, and sometimes you try to find something that's in common, you do whatever you got to do. How do you like peanut butter? Something stupid that you don't even know is going to happen. And it just spurs a thing, it just gets them where they got to go.
Exactly. As long as that somewhere is down and not via jumping, down safely, then hey, whatever you got to do, whatever common ground you can find, because that's some of the things that you got to realize too, as I've highlighted in the past in this miniseries, which is cool as part of ESU's training, is that in addition to being trained as emergency medical technicians, some guys come into the unit already EMTs, in some cases paramedics too. It's also, and I kid you not, this is very cool, emergency psychological technician. Sure. You got to know how to talk to people on the fly in those spots.
EPT. Yeah, and you're leaving out again. Vick came in as a doctor.
It's a doctor, yeah.
There it is. You talk about a well-rounded unit where everybody was something. It's just the way it was.
Yeah. Guys have their strengths, tactical strengths, medical strengths, rescue strengths. Some guys are jack of all trades. Listen, there's really no weaknesses. There's no room for weaknesses in a unit like ESU. Everybody helps each other out in that regard. A couple comments from LinkedIn. Carl Duenzel has been on this show before. It says, taught me everything but how to spell my name correctly. Looking good, Carl. Good to see you, my friend. Hope all's well with you, Carl. And Billy Dempsey's watching too. He says, hello, Carl. Hope all's well. Great guy to have on the show, Mike. I certainly agree. Billy, you'd be a great guy to have on the show too. So I'd love to have you on sometime, Billy, if you're willing. So listen, you got, like I said, whatever list you got, whatever stories you want to tell, by all means. I don't care what job.
I'm gonna jump around a little bit. I'm gonna jump back a little bit. Like I'm early in the job. I'm in emergency service, brand new in emergency service, and we go to a job where a guy has got he's fallen in his house. He's either broken his leg, but he can't get to the door. So now, like I said, they want to rabbit tool the door. They want to try to break the door open. And I tell the officer in charge, I says, look, I can pick that lock open. I says, and we'll save the lock. I says, and then we'll be able to secure the apartment and everything will be good. So once I pick it open, he says to me, he says, "Can you teach that to other people?" I said, "Sure, I can." So that's how I wind up down at STS. That's how I wind up being in training school. And while I'm there, they make me a rappel master. We taught tools. We did a lot of excellent stuff down there with like the class that we had. And the course was very, very popular. I would bring in people from like the 6.0 and people, well, not only 6.0, but guys that wanted to learn it just as a skill, and they would give them permission to be there. So I'm sitting in the room one day, and I'm getting ready for the class to come in, and I look up, and the CO is there. The CO of emergency service is sitting in the room, and I said, "What's up?" He says, "I got to see what all the hype is about." He said, "I got to see what all the hoopla is about." He said, "I'm going to sit through your class." I said, "Okay." So he sits through the class. He goes home. He calls me up the next day at Six Truck, and he says to me, he says, "You know what?" He says, "You cost me a lot of money." I said, "What do you mean I cost you a lot of money?" He says, "I went home and I picked every lock in my house. My wife said, I have to change all the locks." She says, "If you could do it, anybody could do it," she said. So he says, "Got to change all the locks." So she made him change all the locks on the doors because he picked the doors open.
And that's the thing. I'm glad you brought that up too. That's another really valuable skill set that emergency service has, where if you think about it, and this is not you, anybody who watches the show knows how much I love the fire department. This is by no means knocking the fire department, no means making fun of the FDNY. I love those guys. But when they come in and take a door, and this is not any fault of theirs. They're trained to do this. They destroy the door. That's what they're trained to do. They take the door down. You guys, I mean, because think about it. Now a cop has to sit there watching the door for 8 hours. You guys come in, finesse the lock, get the lock open, get the door open, get what you got to get, whatever it may be, and that cop doesn't have to stand there for 8 hours.
Listen, there was a time, and it's probably still the same. I don't know for sure, but I remember Radio City Music Hall would not allow the fire department to come in and work on their elevators because those Art Deco doors are priceless, and they didn't want them throwing a Hearst tool or a crowbar or a Halligan tool into the doors and prying the doors open. Emergency service would go in and again, we'd slip the locks. We spent time down at the school, teaching guys. We had a door set up and how to open the doors, drop keys and slip the bolts and stuff like that. All different ways to get in, But I remember specifically that they weren't allowed to go into the building because, they would probably, maybe they did it once or twice, and then they said, "Wait, we can't do this again." The doors are priceless.
Right. Right. And listen, it sounds bougie, but it's true. A lot of these buildings, especially in that part of Manhattan, I'm not saying it's right, but I can understand the philosophy because it is going to cost them a lot of money too. So if there's a safer way to do it, a more pragmatic way to do it, well, then that's where you guys come in. Caitlin Langone, Tommy Langone's daughter, is in the chat. She's been on the show before, and she's saying, "Loving the talk, Carl. This is Caitlin Langone. Just wanted to ask you if you ever got the chance to teach my dad, Tommy."
Tommy Langone, of course I did. Sure. Yeah. Oh, Tommy was an ace guy. I think I went to where'd we go together? We went to Puerto Rico together, I think, Tommy and I. Tommy, me,
for the hurricane?
No, we went as a I'll tell you what happened. Emergency service bought the Stanley tool. Now I don't know if you're familiar with the Stanley tool. It's a hydraulic unit. And what it is that there's a hydraulic base. It's a motor with a hydraulic pump that it runs a myriad of tools. It runs saws, it runs drills, it runs hammers, disc breakers, all sorts of tools by just plugging into this one unit. So when we got that tool into emergency service, I made myself know everything about it. I probably knew more about that tool than the salesman who sold it to emergency service by the time I was done. And with that knowledge, I was able to go to Puerto Rico to teach the Puerto Rican rescue team how to operate that tool. And wow. Tommy Langone and Tommy was one of the guys that set that whole thing up, and we went together. Matter of fact, Tommy's asked the little, what's her name? The girl's girl? Caitlin. Ask Caitlin, was your aunt or somebody in a stewardess in the airlines? Because what happened is Tommy somehow upgraded us from where we were flying to first class. I think it was he had got your aunt or something to that, or somebody, or maybe it wasn't your aunt, but maybe it should have been your aunt. I don't know. But we got upgraded from regular to first class, and we flew to Puerto Rico by first class.
Oh, well, I'll wait for her to put that in the chat, but good to see you, Kate. She says, I love these stories. Thanks for sharing. It means the world to me. And of course, her dad, we did a tribute show to her father a while ago.
Yeah, no, her father was. I remember a lot of things. Her father taught me things. We were talking about building construction one time, and you know how parking lots they go up there. They're precast construction when they build parking lots. They'll come in with these large concrete pre-stressed and they build them and everything. And Tommy once said we were standing there looking at something, and he says to me, he says, you know. He says, what goes up in pieces comes down in pieces. Yeah. He said, and it all made sense to me when he said that. No, I knew Tommy very well. Good guy, real good guy.
Absolutely. And she said, yeah, as all 14 of them were, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. She says his father-in-law, Tommy's father-in-law, was a flight engineer for American Airlines.
Okay.
And her grandpa was a flight engineer for American Airlines. So that may have been how they got the upgrade to first class.
That was it.
That tracks. That tracks. So go ahead.
No, I was going to say, when I came back, we flew back the same way. We came back first class, and I was drinking champagne, and the stewardess, every time my cup was empty, well, she had to give me a glass. Every time the glass was empty, she poured more champagne in. And by the time I landed in New York, I was boxed. I was drunk. She takes the glass out of my hand, but she gives me a paper cup. She says, "You can't land with glass, but you can land with a paper cup." And she fills up the paper cup again.
Oh, there you go.
That was a classic. A good
classic indeed. And it brings up an interesting thing I wanted to ask you about too, because Tommy worked in tent truck for the majority of his years in ESU. He got there in '91. You know, the nice thing back then, and I'm sure it's still in effect now, is if a truck is shorthanded, you fly. So you really get the chance to not only learn your own truck, which for you was 6, but all the other trucks in the city. So tell me about, besides 7 and 8, because 7 and 8 are right in your borough, of course, besides Brooklyn, what were the other trucks that you really like flying to?
Let me tell you something. You talk about flying and you say limited to Brooklyn or Queens. That's nonsense. We would come in and on days, because what happened was when I got into a 6 truck, we had a pin job program. All right. We were in competition with the fire department. And each time you went on a pin job, there was a sheet you had to make and your response time and stuff like that. So initially, they overloaded 6 truck with a lot of guys, so you'd be able to put a lot of cars on the street, and you'd always have somebody out there. But what happened was that after the 6 truck got so crowded, guys were flying all over the place. It wouldn't be uncommon for me to fly to 3 truck or 4 truck in the Bronx on a daily basis. It would take you in the morning. It would take you almost 2 hours. You'd get there at lunchtime. You'd go 1 or 2 jobs. You'd hang out, and then you'd start on your way back to get home at 3 o'clock. But That's the way it was. You know, yeah, we flew all over. Johnny Bosch, he was a sergeant over in 9 truck. And he said to me, he says, you know, if you want to come, because when I used to go to 6 truck from where I live here on Long Island, I would pass 9 truck, 7 truck, 8 truck. You know, I would pass all those trucks on my way to 6 truck, you know, and I'd say to myself, what am I, crazy? You know, I could bicycle every day to 9 truck from my house, but I didn't.
You're that close?
Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah. I was probably 6 miles to 8 miles, something like that. I was 30 miles. I was 30 miles from 6 truck, and you sit on the Bell Parkway, you know that 30 miles doesn't turn into 30 minutes. You're looking at an hour and a half, 2 hours sometimes, depending upon what time you got home.
Yeah. So, but then again, it's the love of the truck, and obviously the guys you're working with that keep you showing up.
That's it. And another benefit to being in 6 truck was the fact that I still was able to go to the 6-0 because my wife worked there, you know, and a lot of times my wife and I would come to work. Let's say I was doing a 4 to 12, my wife would do a day tour, whatever tour she did. It was a special tour for her because she was a clerical person for the most part. But, you know, she was a captain's secretary. But she was still a police officer. So what would happen is that I would be home with my son in the morning, and then on my way into work, I'd meet my wife at Rockaway Parkway, and then we'd switch my son in the car seat, put him in the car seat, I continue on to work, and then she'd come home. So it was beneficial for me to do that. Otherwise, we couldn't do that. You know, that's the way it was.
So you fast forward a little bit, and it's an interesting time, you know, because now you get to 94, 95, and now you got about 10 years in the units, and it's flying by because you came in as a new guy in 85, And now you're in a position a decade into it where you're comfortable in what you're doing. You're comfortable in the fact that you could teach others. You could do the same thing guys did for you when you first came in and pass that down. So besides things like lock picking, safe picking, which is something obviously you were very good at, as you talked about, tell me about some of the other skills that you really, any new E-man or E-woman that was coming into Truck 6, tell me about some of the things that you really enjoyed teaching them besides the stuff that we mentioned earlier.
Well, it's very important. I'm going to get down to basics here, but it's very important to know the difference between a mixed fuel, and straight gas, because right. that you put a mixed fuel into all your 2-stroke machines, and you put gasoline into your 4-cycle machines. So it's very important to teach people that right off the bat. It's, as trivial as it sounds, it was very important because, and you had to mix the gas properly. Otherwise, we used the steel chainsaws. We didn't buy junk. They were $300-400 chainsaws at that point in time, maybe more than that. And you put a straight gas mix into that saw, you wiped it out. It's done. You burn up the piston, you burn up the sleeve, you take the saw out of service. So a lot of times I would stress the engines on the kids and the new people, and we'd go down and go over the pumps. Whatever had a motor on it, you know what I mean? Go over the pumps, go over the saws. We had the DM50s, we had the big circular saws. My complaint was that we used an abrasive disc. We used the same. It looked the same, the abrasive discs. I don't know if they've changed it or not. Because you could have used a concrete blade with diamonds on it or carbide for the most part, but we had the abrasive metal and the abrasive concrete, and sometimes if you got them mixed up, they wouldn't cut properly. So that was important to tell people. There was a lot of stuff, little things that made things more important.
Well, of course, and I think that was critical around that time because 94, 95 is an interesting period, as I covered before, where I've often said 95 to 2000 is perhaps this is no offense to the other eras. This is no offense to the guys who are in emergency service right now. But if I could pick a sweet spot in the history of emergency service, it's probably 1995 to 2000 because you get all the guys over when the merger happened from transit rescue and also from housing rescue, which you guys had absorbed earlier prior to 95, but it became official in 1995. So getting those guys was interesting because guys who worked housing rescue knew the projects very well. Any subway jobs, you had the transit rescue guys, and they knew that like the back of their hand. So just tell me about teaching. I mean, and again, even though they're squared away, there's still some things that you have to show them in terms of how NYPD emergency service does it. So I don't know if you got any of the guys in 6 Truck off that merger, but if you did, tell me about teaching them, not as much as you would a brand new guy per se, but nevertheless getting them up to speed on the NYPD way.
Well, the guys that came in were pretty well squared away. And when it came to raising trains, they knew what to do. They knew the deal about picking up a train, and it was important. Believe it or not, when you go to pick up a train, there's one type of train. I mean, I would recognize it if I saw it. I can't remember if it's R86, 96, or whatever it was. But you would have to slip a 2x4 block of wood between the spring and the carrier of the train. All right, to take up the distance that you needed. Otherwise, you would just jack up the suspension. It was little things like that these guys already knew that they imparted upon us. We learned, as far as I'm concerned, some stuff from them as much as they learned from us. I don't think that I ever had a chance to let's go down this route and say, but they were pretty well squared away. Even the girls that came in were pretty good.
Oh, yeah. Listen, you had Anita Rosado there. You had Anthony Zukovich there. Listen, those girls, they didn't need much help with much. They were able to handle themselves just fine. No. I don't think I laughed as hard as when Anita came on, the stories that she was telling me. She literally had me doubled over. I was laughing so hard on this show a couple of years ago. So shout out to her. She's down in Florida now. As I take a swig of water, volume 53 of the E-Men inside the NYPD's emergency service unit. Our guest is Russo. Now, it's interesting because, I don't know if you were there for any of these jobs, but around 93, of course, is when the terrorism threat begins to really become apparent in New York City. Not that there hadn't been incidents before the 70s. There was a lot of domestic bombings, but the Trade Center in 93 changed everything, as we know. And I'll never forget what Sam Katz wrote in the book he did on emergency in 1997, where he said, after that, and this is before 9/11, after that bombing, the guys in ESU were never able to look at the World Trade Center the same again, which is eerie considering what would happen, of course, 4 years after he wrote that book. So I don't know how much terrorism training you guys were doing after the 93 job, but if so, on a citywide level, tell me about some of that stuff that was going on, if at all, back then after that job.
Well, you know that the 93 was they screwed up pretty good on that one. And you know, knowing what I know now about the what was going on, you knew that there was going to be another hit. You know, you just didn't know when it was going to happen. That they wanted to knock those buildings down, and going by taking it out at the foundation just wasn't going to work for them. But things did change. Things changed all over the world. You know, I think the 9/11 is one of those pivotal moments. 9/11, or not even that, the first Trade Center. Those are pivotal moments that people know where they were. You know, like when it's unforgettable. You know, it's hard to believe that people would do that to other people. It's just I marvel at that.
Yeah, you and I both. You and I both. And ESU was about as ready as you could be back then, but I don't think anybody.
There's no doubt about it. You know what? I always say, and I've said this before, and hopefully nobody's listening because I don't want to give them any ideas, but they screwed up by hitting the trade centers. What they should have done, if they wanted to, is they should have hit the Trade Center, and they should have hit the Empire State Building. Then they would have broke up. They would have made mass chaos because we were able to concentrate all of our forces in one spot, all of our utilities and everything we had at one spot. But if we had to be divided, that would have been more of an inconvenience.
Right. You know, but then again, all the damage that was done that day.
Damage that was done that day is still the damage that's happening now, even, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. As we were talking about off the air, just to scale it back a second too, because as guys get more time on, they get trained on this. Driving the truck, which I'm sure you did because you were in the unit for such a long time. Sure. I mean, the REPs, okay, it's a little bit smaller. Of course, you still got to be careful. The streets of New York City with the pedestrians and the other cars are unpredictable. Mm-hmm. But that big truck, anybody that had to drive a fire truck or any of the large ESU rescue trucks, hats off to you guys, man. Because like I often joke in the past in this program, if there was ever an Olympic sport, there you go, that should be added to the games, it's driving an emergency vehicle of that size on the streets of New York. So tell me about the training to be a chauffeur, and of course, again, your tricks and your tactics to being an effective one on the streets of Brooklyn.
Well, this is the sixth truck that was there when I came in. This was brand new when I showed up at the door. Wow. And they had just got this truck from Salisbury. Yeah, that was brand new, and it is something. You know, I'll tell you a funny story. We're going to a pin job on the Gowanus. And now the truck is a truck. You know, I can go as fast as the truck can go. Yeah. You know, and with that, some guy, he passes me. He's doing a buck. He's doing 100 miles an hour. Like he wants to get away from me. He doesn't realize that there's an accident up ahead that he's going to run into. All right. He runs in, he sees the accident, jams on his brakes, spins the car around, hits the guardrail. I get out of my truck and I says, "Are you all right?" And he says, "I think I'm all right." I says, "What were you thinking?" I says, "Where were you going?" I says, "You know, his car was totaled, you know, because he was trying to race past the truck." You know what I mean? But it's just what it is. Like you say, driving this truck through traffic. This was not I'll tell you another funny story. 39th Street. I'm going down to 39th Street. There's a job out on the pier. And it was really cold out, and there was a sheet of ice. I couldn't see it, black ice, sheet of ice. I turned the corner, and I stepped lightly on the pedal. Now the truck just continues going forward, but it's going forward slower. There's a fire truck up the corner. It's a ladder truck, and his ladder is sticking out. He must see that I can't stop this truck. He pulls away at the very last second, and my truck goes into the spot where he was 2 seconds before. Otherwise, it was going to be a horrible accident.
Wow. Yeah. Good foresight on his part, man.
Yeah.
That fire, wherever he is.
Yeah. He must have saw the truck coming and knew that I was sliding. And another story. I turn the corner I come off of 4th Avenue onto 65th Street. And I'm going down 65th Street. All of a sudden, I feel a little bump, like just a little bump in my backside. Something doesn't feel right. I look in the rearview mirror, and my truck is crabbing down the street. The front wheels are here, the back wheels are here, and I'm crabbing down the street. I said, "What happened?" So I stopped the truck right where I was. What happened was the shackle had broken on the rear end, and the rear end had come loose on the truck. What could have happened if we were going at any kind of speed and that axle had broken down, we would have flipped that truck over.
And that's things that you got to know too. I mean, again, getting your CDL helps too if you have that prior to coming on the job. But the training that goes into it, it's not just getting to the job, which is the first thing, right? Getting there safely. It's also, and you knew this, having a knowledge of where everything was in the truck. Because sometimes the chauffeur has to stay with the truck guys coming out, grab me this, grab me that. You can't be like, you got to know right off the rip. Okay, this is here, this is there, that's there. So, it's not only something, that you knew for yourself, but also training other guys who were trying to learn how to drive and get qualified there. That's one of the most important things you could run through with them, just knowing where everything is.
There's no doubt about it. And for the most part, most of the trucks, 1 truck, 2 truck, 3 truck, most of the trucks tried to put their stuff in the same place.
Right.
So if you went someplace, you would go. And pretty much, I'll tell you what, when it came for my test, for chauffeur, I forget who it was. Might have been Sergeant Crowley. He says to me, "Go get me the magnet." Like it's an obscure kind of thing. He says, "Get me the magnet." And I knew where the magnet was. That was easy enough to get. He said, "Okay, you're qualified." That was it. You know what I mean? I didn't have to go. Everything else is kind of self-explanatory. We had modified our truck to carry the Stanley tool. And that in itself was a thing. I put a winch in it. I put a small electric winch with a cable that would come down and lift it up, and then we'd push it into place. And we were probably the only truck that carried the Stanley tool.
And that was, again, go ahead, sorry.
No, go on.
And again, that was a critical tool considering the vast emergencies you can encounter, because it's not just the MBAs, it's not just the potential water jobs where a tool like that may or may not factor in. Back then, building collapses because of faulty construction were pretty common. You never know when a tool like that's going to have to come into effect.
Well, like you say, that tool was designed to operate underwater. It's a hydraulic tool. And if you needed, like if a car went in the water, we'll say, and you had to do a door job or do something, you could easily take that tool and just run the hose out and do what you had to do. Same thing with the Hearst jaws. That was a hydraulic operated tool. I see that they use electric tools now that are not as heavy. I mean, the Hearst tool weighed in almost 70 pounds. You need sometime. I watched a fireman do it. They used it as a 2-man tool, but we never did that. We operated as a 1-man tool.
Wow.
But,
talk about strength.
Yeah. Well, that you had to get lucky.
That's true.
I'm going to talk about some of the times that we've worked with outside agencies. Okay.
Sure.
So,
right.
Like the DEA called us one time, and what they had was drums of sodium hydroxide that come in from wherever they came from South American country, someplace. And in the sodium hydroxide, they had hidden cocaine. And it turned out that I think it was about 5 tons of cocaine when we were done. What happened is that we had to go in there. We had to put on hazmat suits. We went to level B suits. And then we would cut the top of the drums out, retrieve the drugs from the sodium hydroxide, and then, dispose of the sodium hydroxide and take the drums. By the time we were done, I think there was 5 tons of cocaine that we had salvaged. The interesting thing is that most of the tools that we used had to be replaced because some of the tools were air powered, and when they were using the air or whatever, they were sucking in the cocaine, not the cocaine, the sodium hydroxide, which is lye. And they were eating up the seals and stuff like that. But the guys, too, were taking a beating. We went by the book religiously. They told you to put the level B suit on, stay dry and stuff like that. But once you put the level B suit on, you sweat. And what we were doing was we were taking the gloves from the level B suit, and we was duct taping the rubber gloves to the hand, to the suit. And then rubber duct taping the rubber boots to the bottom of their legs. But because of the concentration of sodium hydroxide in this place, it was able to get underneath. And a lot of the guys were getting burns from the lye on their arms, on their legs, and stuff like that. But the bottom line is that by the time we were done, we salvaged, I think it was 5 tons of cocaine.
Wow. Jesus. Again, they're clever in how they hide it. Sometimes you see
you want to talk about clever hiding.
Yeah.
Now, we called this the Wheel of Fortune. I don't know if you can see. There's a good
move the picture up a little bit if you can. Just move it up. There we go. Okay.
We call it the Wheel of Fortune. It came in from South America, and what it was a giant cylinder. It was about 12 feet long, about 8 or 10 feet high. It was a giant cylinder, double walled, just about this wall. It was originally designed as a press to make paper. It was a steam press to make paper. But what they did was they built this thing, and in the opening between the inner and the outer lip, now this thing is 10 or 12 feet long, and it's about 8 or 10 feet high, they slid cocaine. They packaged it up squarely, neatly, like little bricks of cocaine. The entire wheel, we called it the Wheel of Fortune. The entire wheel was filled with cocaine. It took us days. It took us days and days to cut through this. We used every tool that you could imagine to trying to get into this thing. We used grinders. We used the Hearst tool. We used airbags, whatever we could try to do to peel this thing off. They built it like it was made to last. But what happened was the DEA, they were tracking this thing all the way from South America. They dropped it off in a warehouse in Long Island City, and there was a guy in there with a small disc grinder. And they got bored with waiting for him to do something with his disc grinder. That's when they let us know so this was a whole joint effort on the part of the DEA and us. You can really see, I don't know if you can see the scope of this. You really have to see. It rode on a big axis. It had steam, supposedly. It had steam that would go into it, but it was massive, massive. And you say to yourself, and beautifully packed. I mean, these guys take each brick was wrapped in plastic, then in foil, and then completely formed perfectly so it would slide into the wheel. And after you would compromise a little piece of the wheel, after you would break a little piece of the wheel away, you'd be able to slide this thing out. It's amazing how much cocaine we pulled out of this thing.
Well, like I've said before, if it was a legal thing, not that I'm advocating for it to be, it shouldn't be, but if it was a legal thing, this would be a Fortune 500 company with the way that they run it. They run it like a business. The problem is this business involves a lot of bloodshed.
There's no doubt about it. There's no doubt about it. A lot of times, bad guys spend more time. What's the word I'm looking for? They could buy it free, half the price. They just steal. I don't know. But it is what it is.
I don't know. I mean, listen, a lot of these guys are not dumb guys. They're just making dumb choices.
Yeah. Here's a job. This one here. This is the knockoffs in the city. This was an FBI thing, trademark counterfeiting. They was, and it's still going on. There's watches. There's watches, there's pocketbooks and stuff like that. So they called me in. There was a safe, and the guy who they were locking up refused to open the safe. Why? Because it was loaded with Rolex or Folex, if you will, Folex watches, and it was so they called me in and they said, can you open it up? I says, I don't know if I can open it up. I always played that game, and I made sure there was no safe that I would walk in and say, oh yeah, this is a box. This is a cracker box. I'm going to get in here in 2 seconds. There's no problem with this one. No. I would always say, look, I can't promise you anything. I'll give it a shot. You know what I mean? So I was able to dial this safe open. And then when we opened it up, like I say, it was filled with millions of dollars of counterfeit stuff. So that was a big one. This is a cop smash luxury counterfeit ring.
And what was this?
When was it? I'll tell you when it was. Hold on a second. Let me get.
What to say? Just go to Chinatown. They're still.
Go to Chinatown. This was May 10th, 2002.
Okay, listen. 23 years ago, but then again, it's still just as prevalent. And the thing is, and I remember having this conversation with Billy Ryan, who sponsors the show, has been a guest in the show several times, where unfortunately people, they know they're getting duped. That's the thing. They'll pay for this, but they don't care because they're not going to pay the full price. They're never going to pay the $1,000 or sometimes more than that for the watch or for the the nice purse if you're trying to get it for your girlfriend or whatever. Even jerseys now. I have a series of throwback jerseys that I own, and there's a place I get them from. It's a totally legal site, but I know it's knockoff jerseys. Listen, because why the full ones cost, the actual ones cost like $200, $300. Even if you have that kind of money, why fork it over? I'm not advocating for knockoffs, but you can see why they still exist.
Oh yeah. Well, my son is a watch collector. He's got a couple of Rolex watches. He's got some of the other high-end watches, and if you were to give him a fake Rolex, he'd be insulted. You know, he says it's not the quality, it's not this, it's not that. But it's sometimes it's hard for experts to tell the difference. But he knows. My son knows.
I got to ask you this too on a slightly unrelated note, but in terms of emergency service, there's a lot of cool details you get to do too, rather it be dignitary protection. Some of them can be a little bit stressful. UNGA's always stressful because there's a lot that goes into it. But dignitary protection or any of the parades if a team wins a championship, and back then the Yankees were keeping you busy. The Rangers had you busy in 1994 as well. So just tell me about any of the cool details you get the chance to be a part of.
Well, I'll tell you a story about a funny detail. You know, one that pops out as long as you say that.
Yeah.
I think it was like one of the first gay pride parades. I think that's what went on. And what happened was I had spoken to the commanding officer, and I says, you know, why you got emergency service here? I says, you know, why, if this was an overtime thing? He says, I'm going to tell you why I have emergency service. He says, you guys have seen everything. He says, I don't know what's going to go on here today. He says, I don't want to have any arrests. He says, if it's consensual between two people, he says, let them have at it. He says, don't get involved unless somebody's getting hurt or somebody's screaming or someone asks for your help. He says, do what you have to do. He says, that's why I have emergency service here. He says, because I can trust you guys not to overreact. I said, all right, that sounds right. With that, now we all break up. You got a post over here on the west side. You got a post, bang, bang, boom. Okay, I'm on West Street. And I'm walking down West Street, and there's this huge crowd in the middle of the street. And I kind of like, let me see what's going on here. I go into the center of the crowd, and there are two people, and they're in a compromising position, if you will, and they're in the middle of the street. And the people are just watching, you know. And I had to turn around and walk away. So now I walk into a pizza place about a block away. And in there is a gentleman with his son. And he says to me, officer. I said, yeah. He says, did you see what's going on out in the street? I said, yes, I did. He says, well, can't you do anything about it? I says, sir, I says, my hands are tied. I says, if these people are consensual, I says, my orders to let anything happen. He said, well, it's not right. I says, yeah. I says, I agree with you. It's not right, but that's what's happening. So, yeah. That was like the beginning of the end, I think.
Yeah, and because that's the thing. I mean, listen, if that's going to happen, can you get a room? Get
a room. I'll tell you another funny story. It's what is the Labor Day parade on Eastern Parkway? You know, the West Indian Day parade.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm working with Patty Murphy and Jimmy Cole. Both who are excellent cops, good guys. You know, I can't say enough about them. Actually, Jimmy Cole was my wife's cousin. So he's a family member, if you will. So somehow there was a job that we responded to, but somehow we wound up in the middle of the parade as a parade float going down Eastern Parkway with Truck 6, and where people are applauding and we're in the parade. I have no idea how it happened because I was riding in the back, and the next thing I know, we're on Eastern Parkway and we're part of the parade. So you never know where you're going to wind up.
Happy accident.
Yeah,
happy accident.
Hey, you know what? Nobody got hurt. Nobody got nothing. I think that was the year that there was a fella who had fallen off a float and then got run over by the float.
Yeah, somebody told me that story a few weeks ago. I'm trying to remember. I think it might have been Mike Grant. Yeah, it was one of those years that somebody did. Yeah, and there's a lot of interesting stories with that particular detail. It's not an easy detail to work, but boy.
You can guarantee there's going to be shots fired somewhere on that one.
Yeah,
and yet they allow it to happen each year, you know, which is incredible.
It's the best thing, and don't get mad at me for saying this, folks. I'm not trying to be insulting or crass when I say it, but it's essentially a very, very ghetto version of Mardi Gras.
Yeah. It is what. That's an excellent point. And you know, the Crown Heights riots. I don't know if you remember that or not.
Was that after Kiko Garcia got shot, or the Jewish guy ran over the black kid?
That's the Jewish guy running over the kid.
Right, yeah. I'm thinking of Washington Heights with the other one.
Yeah, the hot solar. And what happened was that went sour really quickly. Also, you know, my wife worked a lot on that, the details and stuff like that. But that was another horror story. You know, it was a terrible accident, and you know, it was taken way out of proportion. But that's what happened.
Yeah, that is, and again, You never know what you're going to be thrust into, because that went on for a few days. And I think because Washington Heights, after the Garcia shooting, was 91. Crown Heights was 92. And of course, there was the controversial with 91, Let Them Vent by Mayor Dinkins, which Chief Anamone put a stop to real quick. So 92, guys had learned their lesson and they were ready, even though it was unfortunate they were ready. And things died down a hell of a lot quicker in 92 than they did the previous year, at least.
Yeah.
So,
well, 92, like you say, was it 92? Let me see. No, 89. Let me see. 91 it was, 91. Let's go to the 14th Street train wreck. Are you familiar with that at all?
That was the derailment, right? With Rob Ray, the drunk conductor. Yeah, I did a show.
That's exactly right, a derailment. And, the bottom line is that this guy was drunk to begin with, and he should have never been running a train. There was 216 people on that train, and 5 people died that night.
Yeah.
He was doing. Now, what happened is that we were on another detail. We were out at all right, we were in Manhattan already, down at the park, Tompkins Square Park.
Tompkins Square Park. I was going to say that was a conflagration of its own.
Yeah, exactly. And again, they put us out there. I don't know why, because it was more of a patrol kind of thing. We were securing the premise, but we were there, and we were there 24 hours. They had us there on overtime and stuff. But we were finishing up a tour. It was we were finished. We were on our way home. We were face to face, and we were leaving. But about 12:10, 12:15, maybe a little earlier, whatever, I don't remember the exact time, the call comes in that there's a train wreck on 14th Street, a train derailment on 14th Street. What happened is that this guy was drunk. And if you go to the Wikipedia and you read up about it, he admits, he says that he blacked out at 28th Street. He says at 28th Street, that's the last thing he remembers. And the train was doing about 50, 55 miles an hour at that point in time. Much too fast to come into 14th Street, because at 14th Street, just above 14th Street or below 14th Street, they were doing some work. So at 14th Street, he was supposed to switch from one lane to the other lane, one track to the other track. And because he was going so fast, when he went to do that switch, he wasn't able to do it. The train was going too fast. And the locks that come down to slow a train down, he was going too fast that he knocked them down, and the train just did whatever it wanted to do. So now we leave Tompkins Square Park. We're probably the first people there. We are probably the first people there because Tompkins Square Park in relationship to where the 14th Street was. We're at 14th Street and Lexington Avenue. So now I go down the subway. I look at the first train where the motorman should be. The train is now wrapped around a steel column, end to end. The roof has been ripped off, and I can't tell where one train begins, one car begins, and one car ends. It's a mess. The only thing I do notice is that the first train, the motorman is missing. I don't know where the motorman is. So now I said to the guys there, I says, let's see if we can find this, if this guy has been ejected or where it was. Little did we know that he was sitting across the street watching the thing the whole time because he was still drunk. And he had 2 beers after he got out to try and calm his nerves down. I think if you look at the Wikipedia, he blew a crazy number when he was drunk. But he should never have been running the train. So now I'm down there with Tommy Abansky. Nice guy, Tommy Abansky. Tommy and I go way back. So we're searching the train for bodies or whoever's alive, whoever we can help. We find this one guy. Now, I don't know what magic happens or how this happens, but I've been on 2 separate jobs where a person has been knocked out of their clothing. Don't know how that happens, but people have been knocked out of their clothing. I don't know if they're trying to get out. This guy is pinned in the train car, but he's naked. All right? So now, but what the funny part is there's a dead body on top of him. So he can't get out. The dead body's on top of him. The Tommy and I, now, we're there to help this guy out. So we take the dead body, we grab the body, we take the body out of there, and we put it up on the roof of the train. Now we're trying to get this guy out. but he's been in the train. It's 140 degrees down in that tunnel. It becomes 140 degrees down there with everybody down there. We're trying to run tools. You're using your tools for extrication and stuff like that to spread things apart, but you're creating a hazardous environment. You got hazardous gases. You got carbon monoxide. You got whatever you want is bad. It's down there at this point in time. And it's like I say, 140 degrees down there. Interesting point. Just let me go back 1 second. While we're searching around, I find a broken water pipe. Mm-hmm. And with this water pipe, it becomes my oasis. Every time I start to feel a little drowsy or I feel a little bad or feel something, oozy, I go back to the water pipe and I take a shower. The water is squirting like crazy. So I'm soaking wet. I'm drinking water. I'm hydrating. I'm in pretty good condition for 140 degrees. Back to me and Tommy with the dead body. We've taken the body off the top and we've put it on top of the train car. Now we're trying to get this guy. He's got no clothes on. Like I say, don't know why he's got no clothes on, but he's naked. He's got blasted out of his clothes somehow. So we reach down. So Tommy's trying to grab him. So Tommy says, I can't get him. He's slippery. I says, grab onto something. So Tommy says, I can't. I said, grab onto his schmanky. So the guy says, you guys got to stop fooling around. He says, and get me out of here. He says, get me out of here. So ultimately, we're able to get him out. We free him and we get him out there. P.S. A week goes by, and Mayor Dinkins had showed up at the location, and he had a press conference right from there. He said that we're looking for. Here we are. Here's a picture of me and my sister-in-law. Can you see that?
There you are. Yeah, we can see that pretty good. Yeah.
Yeah. Me and my sister-in-law. That's my wife's sister, and we're at the train wreck, and so about a week later, Mayor Dinkins, he has a party at Gracie Mansion for all of the rescue workers, all the first responders to the train wreck. So Tommy and I are sitting on the steps of Gracie Mansion. We're just sitting there, and I've got a bottle of beer in my hand, and Tommy's got a bottle of beer in his hand. But unbeknownst to us, we don't realize it at this point in time. Everybody else who's been drinking beer has lined up all the bottles in back of us, so that it looked like we had like 6 or 8 cases of beer, at least. So somebody walks in, one of the officials walk in, I don't know, deputy mayor or something, and he looks at all the bottles in back of us, and he looks at us drinking the beer, and he said, boys, you guys drank a lot of beer. So Tommy turns around and he looks, and then he says, that's nothing. He says, you should see what we do at the firehouse, he says. So so that was a nice thing.
Absolutely, in the aftermath, it's such a job.
Yeah. Mayor Dinkins did. I don't remember ever going to Gracie Mansion for a party for first responders. I'll tell you a story about Gracie Mansion. One night, Jerry Daniello and myself were on a sniper post on the roof, and it's cold. It's cold and it's damp. It's cold, and we're on the roof. So I said to Jerry, Jerry, they're having a party downstairs. I said, they're eating, they're drinking. I said, they're having a good time. I says, I'm going downstairs. I said, I want to see if I can get us maybe some hot chocolate for me. I says, a cup of coffee for you. I says, I'm done. I says, this is, nobody's going to shoot these people. I said, they're in the building. I said, we're on the post. I says, and we're freezing. So with that, I leave the roof. I come down the flight of stairs. And as I'm coming down the stairs, some guy in a suit says to me, he says, can I help you, officer? So I said to myself, I could play this 2 ways. I says, I could be nice and tell him what I need. I says, or I can say, no, you can't help me, So I says to him, I says, yeah, I said, maybe you can help me. I says, my partner and I are on the roof. I says, and we're freezing. I says, I would like to see if I can get some hot chocolate for myself, maybe some coffee for my friend for my friend Jerry. He says, all right. He says, go upstairs. He says, I'll see what I can do for you. I says, okay. So about 5 or 10 minutes go by, and this first grade detective comes upstairs. He's got a platter in his hand, a silver platter. He's got a pot of hot chocolate on one side, a pot of coffee in the other, and all sorts of pastry in the middle of the plate. All sorts of Danish and pastry and fancy stuff. And he says to me, he says, which one of yous yelled at the chief? He says, which one of yous guys yelled at the chief? I said, I didn't yell at him. I said, but that would be me. He says, he sends this up with his compliments. I said, well, tell him I said, thank you very much. So, you turn something bad into something good.
Awesome. Awesome. And there's a lot of great stories like that from that era. And, listen, you never forget executives like that to take care of the men. And that was a chief who certainly in that moment did. So props to that chief, wherever he may be.
Well, I'll tell you a funny story.
Please do.
When I was in the RIP unit, there used to be a place at headquarters called Catch, and it was just another place with more photographs and everything. And we had this high visibility robbery that had gone down, and the guy had taken a beating and this and that and the other thing. So my boss told me, he says, take him down to the Catch unit and let him look through some pictures of it. Let's see if we can narrow it down to what we're looking for. I says, okay. So I take him down to the Catch unit, and I park in front of police headquarters. And it says no parking for press only. For press only, it says. So I park there. I says, who's going to give me a summons? So I come out, and there's a captain there. And he says to me, is this your car? I says, yeah. He says, they sent me out here to stick one up your backside. He says, I said, what do you mean? He says, you're not allowed to park here. I says, Cap, I said, let me explain something to you. This guy was robbed. I said, take a look at him. The guy is bandaged up. He's bandaged. He's got braces. He's walking with a crutch and stuff. I says, I was requested to take him to the Catch unit. I says, I had no place to park. I said, this is as close as I could park him. I was able to talk myself out of that one. You know what I mean? Because he says, they sent me to stick one down your back. I says, why? Because the press has got no place to park and the police car is here. That he says, well, he says, you can't do it again. I said, well, thank you very much. And he let me go on that one.
Reasonable. Listen, that's all you need. John Valenti. Yeah, exactly. John Valenti's in the chat, by the way. He's watching via LinkedIn. He says, it was an honor working with Carl in ESU Truck 6. If you didn't know something, Carl always took the time to teach you. A true E-man. Thank you, John, for the comment. John, I'm trying to get you on the show too, so give me a call when you can.
John Valenti's a good kid too.
Yeah, I'd love to get John on the show sometime and do some conversation with him if he's willing. So, John, you got my number. It should be on the LinkedIn contact section. Give me a call when you are so inclined, my friend. Good to see you. So you're having a blast, and then we get to 2001. And, at the end of those 20 years, you decided to leave. So what made you say, you know what, I had a lot of fun doing this. 16 of the 20 years that you were on the job were in emergency. What made you go?
Well, what made me go, and probably I would have not gone, is that my son goes into school at that point in time. He goes into kindergarten. And now we need to have somebody here full time. Somebody's got to retire. I'm in the right position to retire. And I do. So I stay home and become a stay-home dad. You know what I mean? My wife is finishing up her time on the job. And my son he's in school, and I'm taking him to school every day and spending the summer vacation with him. When he's on summer vacation, we called it Camp Carl because my son's name is Carl. And we would go every place. We'd go to the museums. We go to the arcade. We go to Coney Island, like I said, and we do everything together. And that's the way it was. So that's why I had to leave more than anything. It's not something I wanted to do. I'll tell you a funny story, and it still goes on. You go to a wedding or you go someplace, and earlier on when I first retired, people would say, oh, do you miss it? And I'd say every day, and my wife would say, why do you tell that? Because I do. I miss it every day. Every day there's I miss doing what I did. I miss being with the people more than anything else. We were in Manhattan one night. It was Billy DeSantis and myself. We were in Manhattan, and a couple comes out of a liquor store, and they got a bottle of wine in their hand, and they're going to go and walk to Central Park, and they're going to sit down and drink the bottle of wine. But the guy doesn't have a corkscrew or a bottle opener. And I hear him talking to the girl. He says, I don't know how we're going to open this. Now, realistically, I thought about that because I know liquor stores, they'll sell you a cheap dollar corkscrew or something to pop it open. But he just didn't think about it. So he says to the girl, he says, I don't know how we're going to open this. She says, oh, we'll figure it out. And then they're walking away. But I overhear the entire conversation. So I call the guy. I said, come over here. He says, what? I said, come over here for a second. I said, where are you going? He said, oh, we're going to Central Park. We're going to sit down. I said, give me the bottle of wine. He looks at me like, what is this guy going to do? Take my wine from me? I said, give me the bottle of wine. I carried a Swiss Army knife like everybody else did with my corkscrew on it. I pulled the cork out from him. I put it back in a little bit. I said, have a good time. I says, and be good. And he said, and he looked at me like he was amazed. He says, you're going to let me go? I said, yeah. I says, there's different types of people. You're not going to be you're not going to be riding around and making noise. I said, you're going to sit down with your girlfriend. You're going to have a glass of wine. You're going to have a good time. That's what's up. There's a huge difference. I says, enjoy yourself. And the guy, another positive interaction with a police officer. For the most part, when a fireman comes to your house, he's doing the right thing. He's putting a fire out. He's trying to help you out sometime. You've got some sort of problem medically or something. When a cop comes to somebody's door, usually it's bad news. Hello, somebody has died. Somebody's in an accident. They're not there to spread niceties. Usually, they're there to bring you. So any small thing that you could do as a cop to help people be happy about it, you do it.
Exactly. And there's so many stories like that. And there's so many times where the emergency service specifically has had a role in that. You come upon a lot of ugly situations, but there's plenty of uplifting situations too. And ESU is a big part of that on the job.
Oh,
That's
sure.
why I like telling these stories.
It's about 2:00 in the afternoon, and the job comes over. It's on 65th Street, and I think maybe 2nd Avenue, 3rd Avenue. I forget where exactly it was. And there's a kid locked in a safe. Now, if there was ever a job that had my name on it, that's the job.
That's the job.
Right? That's the job.
Yeah.
So we roll on that. We pull up. And what happened is that the two kids were playing hide and seek. His brother hides in his father's safe and closes the door, locks the door, and spins the dial on the kid. The kid is locked in the safe. There's bad news here. So I show up. And I said to the father, I says, do you have any combination on this thing? He says, well, I got 1 or 2 numbers. He says, I don't remember the numbers all that well, this and that. Because there's a codicil, there's an addendum to this, there's a background to this. What happens later on, I'll tell you. I said, well, give me the numbers you got. So he gives me 2 numbers, and I start to fool around with the 2 numbers he gives me, and I'm fooling around. All right. The fire department is there, but luckily, the fire chief who shows up with them was a friend of mine who worked in the 6-0 with me, who went from the police department to the fire department. Okay, Ricky Flood. And then his brother Jimmy still worked in the 6-0. So Ricky stands back. He takes a backside because these guys are ready to throw a DM50 or a Hearst tool into the door and try to pop the safe open with the kid. I said, give me a few minutes. I said, let me see what I could do here. So back and forth. I open the safe up, take the kid out. The reason the father didn't want to give us the numbers, didn't want to give us whatever, was because he was a drug dealer. The safe was filled with his son and drugs. So we had to take the kid out, and then we had to lock the father up for the drugs. So
again, only in New York.
Yeah.
Only in New York.
It's stories that you say to yourself,
I did that. I lived that, and you sure did in those 20 years. And then, well, this conversation has flown by. It's been very enjoyable. Billy Kennedy, you are right in the chat, my friend. Carl, you're bringing back so many great memories. He says, great interview. Indeed, it was. Kevin Kuchler also says hello. Of course, he works in Truck One. Great man, better man. Good to see you, my friend. He was a guest in this show, like Billy was a while ago. So that brings us now into the rapid fire. It's been a hell of a conversation. I've really enjoyed this. 5 hit-and-run questions from me, 5 hit-and-run answers from you. Hopefully, we'll have a sponsor for this pretty soon. So, producer Victor, fire up the music if you're so inclined for this segment. And besides the Stanley tool, here's the first question, the rapid fire. Favorite tool that you like to carry on the truck?
Carry with me?
Yeah, favorite tool on the truck, I mean. The truck carried.
Just something that was on the truck?
Yeah, besides the Stanley.
I thought the rabbit tool was a very versatile tool. The rabbit tool, I used to use it. Are you familiar with the rabbit tool at all?
Yeah, I've heard guys have talked about it on the show.
Okay, it's a small handheld hydraulic unit with a piston and 2 flat jaws that interlock into each other. And when you pump it up, they separate. So you can get it into a crack, maybe a 1/4 inch, maybe 3/8. 3/8 is big. 1/4 inch or something, you could get it in there and you would pump it. And when you pumped it, it would actually lift itself up so you could blow a door open. And I used the rabbit tool a lot for entries on doors that were, we needed to get into. Windows, sometime when you had a person, you'd go into a fire escape and the person was down on the floor. I thought the rabbit tool was a pretty versatile tool, but you can't knock a Halligan tool and you can't knock a sledgehammer. You know what I mean? Those things got you through.
Absolutely. Second question on the rapid fire. Most uplifting job you had in Truck 6?
The uplifting job I had to be the fellow on Christmas Eve. All right, when the guy and I said to him, I said, you don't want your children to remember this every Christmas Eve or every Christmas that you killed yourself on this date. Because like I say, for years afterwards, that guy would call me up on Christmas Eve or whenever I was in, because he would call up. Usually I was there. And I don't know if he would call and say, when's this guy coming in? And somebody would tell him when I'm coming in. But I always picked up the phone and he would say, because I'd say, 6th Truck Police Officer Russo, can I help you? And he'd say, is that you? And I say, yeah, it's me. Is that you? And, the guy got along well.
Absolutely. And again, it's good to see that he was doing a heck of a lot better. Third question to rapid fire. From your time teaching STS, what was the most enjoyable but hardest class to teach?
You know what? The ropes are very hard for some people. I don't know why. Well, I know why, because it was hard for some people. Some people couldn't make a clove hitch. Some people couldn't make a square knot. And the knot that they couldn't seem to make the most was you would make an 8 at the end of the line, just like to just drop it. Almost like the 8 was the hardest line to make. Or when you were going to secure the tail end, you would tie it up and then you'd secure the end so it wouldn't dangle and everything. People seem to have a problem with that. Tying shoes is I guess the limit, but a lot of guys excelled in that. Kenny was very good. Kenny Richardson was a very good knot guy. Matter of fact, he's the only guy that I ever knew that can make a monkey ball. You ever see the monkey fist ball? It's woven into itself and it becomes a ball. They used it on old wooden ships to throw the line between each ship. They would put the ball on the end of the line and then they would throw the ball. It was called a monkey fist.
I've seen it. I have to learn how to do it. I'm trying to get out to fire down here in Connecticut. So clove hitch is something I've been doing a lot of lately, especially when you got those extension ladders. You got to know how to tie it off the clove hitch.
Oh,
so, yeah.
I had a guy one time, I know you're on a roll. You want to end it.
No, that's fine. Go ahead.
Again, when I was the rappel master, I had the guy hooked up. The only thing that wasn't hooked up to him, he didn't have his 8 ring attached to the carabiner. He wasn't ready to go, right? Jeez. So I said to him, I says, you ready? He says, yeah. I says, you ready? He says, yeah. And then I lean over and I attach the carabiner to his 8 ring. And he looks at me like, he realized he wasn't ready. He was ready to go out the door, in the helicopter.
Permanently.
Yeah, but he wasn't ready. I says, you ready? He says, yeah. I says, are you ready? He says, yeah. And I grab the freaking thing and I hook it up and I says, now you're ready.
Yeah, it saved his life. Yeah, listen, he was going to go out the door, all right, but not in the way that he envisioned. Yeah, he was going.
And it's a huge responsibility. You got to look at these guys up and down. You got to make sure that the rope is where it should be. Between the legs and whatever sides you're going down. Left-handed, right-handed, whatever you're doing. It's important to be squared away with that. There's no error for margin. Margin for error in that one. We had a guy one time in a nursing home. And the 2 doors came together. The bathroom door was here, and the opening door was here. So you couldn't open you couldn't get in because the bathroom door. It was a bad design in the building. It was a terrible design. So what happened is that they were going to come over the roof and come through the window. And when I went up to look to see what they hooked onto, I said, "This is no good for you." I said, "You find something else to hook onto." They had hooked onto the cast iron vent that came out of the roof. It looks secure, but it's only held in with lead and whatever. I said, look, this is no good. I said, find another place to secure this rope. I said, before you do what you're going to do. There's plenty of rope, even if you had to go to the other side of the building and tie off on something.
And here's the thing, too. As I've heard 1,000 times over, doesn't matter if you're in a special operations unit like, emergency service on the police side or the fire department side. It's a perishable skill. You got to stay up on it. If you don't stay up on it, you're going to lose that skill.
There's no doubt about it. I've forgotten many things that I would have to go back to school and be retrained somehow. There's no doubt about it. There's a lot of things that I've forgotten. And I tell my son, I says, everything I know, but not everything I know. You know what I mean? It's that kind of thing. Yeah, I knew. I've forgotten a lot of stuff.
Right. Well, listen, and the guys that were in the chat tonight that were in emergency, you guys can attest to the same thing. It's important to stay up on it. Mrs. Sims, this is the 4th question of the rapid fire. Mrs. Sims taught you a lot. What's one lesson she taught you, either directly or just by the way she carried herself, rather, that stuck with you?
Yeah, I tell you about Mrs. Sims. I called her Miss Sims. You know what I mean? Ms. Sims is, but she was a Mrs. And she had a family of her own. Like I say, her grandson's name was Boo Boo. I know that I'm going to hear that later on from somebody, but her grandson's name was Boo Boo, and him and I were best friends. You know what? Back then, you didn't have to think about teaching anybody anything because everybody was natural. Everybody was, it didn't matter if she was black, I was white. It didn't exist back then for some reason. You know, everybody was treated the same way, at least in my neighborhood on Franklin Avenue. You know, across the street was Frank's Boot Black. It was a place where they used to go and get their shoes polished. Up the block was Carl's Chicken Shack. You know, the neighborhood was in transition, but nobody cared. Nobody panicked. Nobody did anything. It was just the way it was. You know, you accepted it, and you accepted these people as friends. What I learned from her, I don't know. She was always on time. I mean, I tell you that, to be honest with you. You know, she'd pick me up at school and take me back to the house, and I told you about it. She'd make this yellow cake with this pink frosting, you know, every so often. I knew that as I was walking up the steps, because she lived up on the 3rd floor, I would smell the cake. I knew she was baked or had baked, and there was cake in the oven there.
Absolutely. That's one of the best smells. You know, that's where you thank the Lord for the sense of smell, because, man, I don't like a good cake. I can agree with you on that one. Final question of the rapid fire, and I'm sure there's a lot to unpack here, but if you had to pick one thing, if you could define it in a sentence, rather, what's the thing you miss most about working at ESU?
I just think that, you know what, working in ESU, I'm sorry.
At ESU.
Yeah. Working in ESU, it's the camaraderie. You know, we spent Christmases together. You know, we spent Thanksgivings together. We spent, you know, it was almost like your second family. You know, the guys there, they were there for you most of the time. You know, if there was an issue, you know, we had one guy, I'm not going to mention any names to besmirch anybody, but we had one guy that was, you know, he had problems, girl problems. And, you know, we put him on suicide watch, you know, because we worried about the guy. You know, we just had it on our own. Nobody ratted the guy out. We tried to take care of him. We did whatever we had to do. And, you know, it's just the way it was. You know, it was my extended family. And I miss most of all is my interaction with the people on the street. You know, a lot of people didn't know who emergency service was. We were in Central Park one time, and the ABC News van got stuck in the grass. Somehow it had rained, and the news van has got generators and all sorts of nonsense in it, and they got stuck in the rain. So I was at one truck that night. So we went out with one truck. We go over there to help them out. And the guy who's driving the van, he says, "Who are you guys? You know, what department are you? Because, you know, we're wearing baseball caps. You don't really know who, you know, who are you guys?" He says, "Well," I said, "we're emergency service." And, you know, we're the guys that are going to get your van unstuck in the mud. I said, "That's who we are." So we took the cable, we double whipped it, you know, we sent it out, we came back, so we get the double strength out of the cable, we put it out. He says, "The tow truck tried to pull me out before, he couldn't get me out." I says, "We'll get you out." And we pulled him out with the ESU truck.
And that's sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
That was one of the things. That's one of the reasons why the uniform flipped for the unit in 94, 95. And that was where it said NYPD Emergency Service Unit on the back and the clear lettering on the front, and they still wear it to this day, NYPD Police.
Well, I'm gonna tell you something. I know that you got your rapid fire thing going.
That's fine. I don't care. This is great. Keep going.
Hold on one second. I'm going to show you something, because that uniform was designed by me and Lieutenant Green.
Rich Green?
Yeah, Richie Green. What happened is that it was, what year did you say that was?
That was 1994, 1995?
Right, 94. Because in 93, what happened was when the World Trade Center gets hit for the first time, the chief is standing on the edge of the hole where the building got struck and everything. And he says, "Who's emergency service? Which guys are emergency service?" And it was hard to tell who was emergency service. So here's me and Lieutenant Green. Can you see that?
Yeah, I see it pretty
good.
Yeah, I see it fine.
So me and Lieutenant Green, they formed the uniform committee. And on the uniform committee, we do research. And I'm pretty much responsible for what the uniform looks like today. Richie Green and I, Jack Cambria was on the uniform committee, and we pretty much put that uniform together. I'll tell you another thing. The longevity bar, you know that white bar that everybody wears with the years they've been on?
Yep.
I made that very first longevity bar that on the uniform committee. I made the first one on my table, and then it was reproduced and used as a department, so that it was adapted by the department after I made it. It has meaning. The white bar mean was a pure kind of thing, and the gold trim around it meant 5 golden years, 10 golden years, and I did it in Roman numerals. If you look, it's in Roman numerals, or it should be unless they change it, so that it was like a historical thing, a longevity kind of thing. The whole white bar has a meaning to it.
It
Made,
goes.
made on my kitchen table.
Yeah, and again, that uniform, one of the key aspects of it, and I'm going to share something momentarily from that I got from Google, the search for that. One of the key things that I talked about with my core was on a while ago, is just that it was key in making sure that the public knew who you guys were. And I know it's a smaller picture, but you can see again the template of the uniform to this day: NYPD Police Emergency Service Unit on the front, along with the last name of the officer, their badge number underneath, the cap, and then of course you go to the back of it and it says NYPD Police Emergency Service Unit, because I think there were some jobs you guys were getting confused with firemen. So that was one of the main things from 1994 to this day. I didn't know that. I knew my corps had something to do with it too, but I talked to one of the guys tonight. There you go. I learned something else.
No, Richie Green, Jack Cambria, myself, a couple other people. We went through a lot of things. There was a lot of different things. Jack was like the poster boy. There's I think it was called Parks, the uniform down on 3rd Avenue. I think that was the name of it. And they had Jack's picture in there of like the very first uniform. Jack's a good looking guy, eloquent in his speech and stuff like that. You know what I mean? And I think that he always dressed to the nines. You could be on a pin job or something, or you could be under a train and everybody come out filthy, and Jack would come out mint like he just came out of the shower. We were on a train job one time, and I came out. My shoes were a mess. My feet were in the mud. My shoes were in the mud. And the commanding officer walks over to me and he looks at my shoes and he says, rub a Hershey bar on those. He says, do something about those shoes. I said, Chief, I just came out from the train. Give me a break. So.
Rick Martinez is in the chat, by the way. He's just saying great memories, great times. Rick's been on the show. He was on the show twice for his own episode, and then of course when I did the show on the 91 Union Square derailment. Jack Cambria has been on the show before too for my hostage negotiation miniseries. So it's great talking with him. And then this is great, man. I have really time's flown by. I don't even know what to say. This was a heck of a conversation, my friend.
Thank you.
Before I say goodbye to the audience, and stick around, we'll talk off air. Any shout outs that you have, by all means, fire away. Whatever shout outs you want to give.
I was going to prepare something because what I want to do is, Six Truck has taken a hit. A lot of our guys have died, and not only from World Trade Center illnesses, but just because, like I say, there was Jack Murphy, Louis Marsicano, Eddie Crean, Bobby Gardello, Stevie Petrullo, Jimmy Cole, Patty Murphy. It's almost like, and I can go on and on and on. It's like 30 guys who have passed away. It's like almost the whole squad is gone. And I feel blessed that myself and still a few of my friends are around, to think that here we are. I mean, I retired, 22 years ago, whatever it is, and I'm still here. And I feel blessed for that.
As you should. And again, thanks for coming on. The way we connected is you reached out via my website, MikeColónmedia.com. And like I said to you off the air before we came on, I'm like, I got to call this guy. I was busy at the time with other stuff. So called you up, and I'm glad I did, because like I said, this was a heck of a conversation. So thank you very much. We will talk off there. Don't go anywhere. And thanks to everybody who tuned in tonight. I appreciate all of you. You did a great job, as always, in the audience. YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook.
Well, let me just tell you. I know that we're almost done, but
listen, go right ahead.
There was one job I wanted to tell you about that I forget.
Floor is yours.
It was Bradhurst Avenue in the Bronx. Okay, it was the middle of January. What happened was we're helping the DEA again. What happened was that they're trying to convict a bunch of guys for drug trafficking and murder. And what happened is that they had shot one woman and thrown her into this abandoned building. The building was had collapsed on the inside of itself. It was a 5-story brick building where all of the floors inside had pancaked. So what happened was that the John McCardle was running the job, and he said to me, "Oh, and I got to tell you the other job too." And John McCardle was running the job, and he said to me, "Well, what do you think we need?" I said, "Well, we're going to need a crane." And he looked at me like I said, the FBI will pay for it. We ever do. He says, and what else are we going to need? So I was with Danny Mullane. Danny's another good guy. Danny says, we're going to need this because what we had to do before we went down into this building that had collapsed in on itself, we had to shore the walls up. We had to put a roof on it. We had to fix the place so that we could go in and make it safe. Otherwise, you were running the risk of all these walls falling down on everybody in the pit. So we built it. We built shoring up. We built the walls. You probably could have lived in this house by the time we were done. And the bottom line was, we found the dead girl. We found one shot to the head. We found her under all the debris, and they were able to convict 8 guys and move right along with that.
Wow.
One more job.
Go ahead.
One more job, and that'll be it. College Point. I get called by Paul Hargrove. I'm at the truck. He says, I need you to come to this address. And so I said, okay, what is it? Oh, I forgot. I got to give you one more job, and you'll love this one. I'm sorry. I got to give you one more.
Don't be sorry. Okay, listen. Floor is yours.
One more. So Paul Hargrove is in College Point, and he says to me, he says, look, he says, we've locked this guy up. He was a soldier of fortune in Vietnam. He was this, he was that. The dog has sat on his safe. In other words, the dog has indicated that there's something in his safe, but the guy won't give us the combination. We don't want to go traditional way of ripping it open and stuff like that. He says, what we want to do, he says, is we want to open it with finesse. I said, okay. So what happens is this. I go to College Point, dial open the safe, and what we do, though, I dial the safe open, but I don't open the door. We use the RMI. We use the robot. I leave the building, and we use the robot to open the door.
John DeLara's favorite tool.
John Skeletor. You know, John was Mr. New York at one point in time.
I heard. I heard they used to call him Skeletor. A friend of mine from the Bob Squad told me they would call him Skeletor.
Yeah. So I opened up the safe, I dial it open, and I leave the room. And then what happens is that we send the RMI in to open the door, and we open it up, and the safe was loaded with guns and ammunition and stuff like that. Trying to find something else.
Because you had all the, which I appreciate, you had all the newspaper clippings tonight too. Made my job easy. I could just sit back and let you go. Like you had a list. Like, you know how organized you got to be. You're one of the most organized guests I've ever had. I'm not just saying it to say.
You know, we had a guy one time. I can't remember. There was something I wanted to tell you about that I just forgot. Oh, I know. Anyway, maybe the next time I'll talk about it, if there's a next time. But I know. When we were deployed to Dominican Republic with the fire department.
This was what I was talking about earlier. 1998, Hurricane George.
Yes, we go to the fire department. We go there with the fire department, and you know what? At first, we're a separate unit. At first, we're not really talking to each other, and you know, it is what it is. But as time goes by, we start to become a cohesive unit, a working unit. You know what I mean? And everybody's with each other. So what happens is that they land us in the middle of the night, and they send us to what's called the Olympic Village. Yes. And evidently there was an Olympics in the Dominican Republic at one point in time. I had no idea about it. So what happens now is that it's middle of the night. There's no light, there's no electricity, there's no water, there's no nothing. So again, with the Stanley tool, at daybreak, I go down and I find a cistern, and it's filled with water, but there's no way to get this water into the building. So what I do is I take the pump out of the Stanley unit and I hook it up into the building, and I start to pump water into the building from the cistern, which is filled with water, and now we can take showers and stuff like that. So what happens later on is that now there's no electricity. So the guy says, one of the guys in the fire department says, I did the math, he says, you can't light those light bulbs with that generator. I said, what makes you say that? He said, well, the generator is 1,500 watts and this and blah, blah, blah. I said, you're getting too technical. I said, let's just give it a shot. I said, let's see what happens. I was able to light up 2 buildings with 2 generators, you know, and we ran the pump almost 24 hours a day, so the guys would have water. They called us the pump house boys. What happened is when we first got off the plane that night, I went out foraging. I found a tractor trailer with all its hoses on it, but had been in a wreck. So I took all the hoses, all the clamps. I used that to hook up everything so that I would be able to get the water to the building with all the stuff that we had. There was no ice. There was nothing to drink there. But we made friends with, just because, don't take this out of, it was a den of iniquity, a house of ill repute across the street from where we were staying. And they were the only ones with ice. And the lady would sell us ice. So we were able to get ice out of that. That was another good job. And I'll tell you a funny story. It's daytime, and we're in the middle of the jungle. We're in Dominican Republic, in the middle of the jungle.
Yep.
And there was a tower and a tree. So I climbed the tower and I climbed the tree, and I look off in the distance. I said, hey, there's a big city over there. I says, Santo Domingo. I says, what city is that? I said, where the hell are we? They said, that's Santo Domingo. I says, why aren't we staying in the city? I says, why are we staying in the jungle? I said.
Builds character. Builds character. And a lot of so I didn't know you were a FEMA guy.
Oh, yeah. I was one of the first FEMA. I was on the first FEMA deployment.
Wow.
One of the first FEMA guys.
Because he had 95 Oklahoma City, a lot of the ESU.
I didn't go to Oklahoma. Mike Hansen went to Oklahoma. He was the guy from Six Truck who went to Oklahoma.
Tommy Langone, Mike Curtin went. I think Pete Conlon went down there too. And then '98, Paul Perricone went down there. This is before he went to the bomb squad. A few of the guys went down there. Quite a few of the guys from FDNY Rescue that 3 years later gave their lives at the Trade Center. So, man, we covered a lot tonight. This was a lot of fun, my friend. So, like I said, stick around. We'll talk off air. Thanks to everybody who tuned in tonight. Again, this was a hell of a show. One of my favorites that I've done. Coming up next in the Mike New podcast, former FDNY commissioner, was head of the union for 13 years. Then when Howard Safer left the FDNY to go be the police commissioner, he made a recommendation to Mayor Giuliani on who he thought the next fire commissioner should be. And that man was Tom Von Essen, who was commissioner from 1996 until the end of the Giuliani administration in 2001. And that man will be joining me this Friday for the milestone volume 75 of The Best of the Bravest, interviews with the FDNY's elite. And next Monday from my hometown, currently the chief of operations for the New Haven Fire Department here in Connecticut, Dan Coughlin, for another volume of what will be the Best of the Bravest nationwide edition. That's next Monday at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. For those of you listening on the audio side, from their 1996 album Load, Metallica, coming your way with King Nothing. In the meantime, on behalf of producer Victor on the ones and twos backstage, and Carl Russo, Mike Colón, this has been volume 53 of the E-Men inside the NYPD's Emergency Service Unit. We'll see you next time. To all the E-Cops working tonight, stay safe. And as the E-Men like to say, anytime, baby. Take care. Good night.